Hey there and welcome back. If the day is finally behind you and the room has gone soft and dim around you and there is nothing left to do but rest, then you have come to the right place and you can let everything else go now, because for the next little while there is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to carry. Tonight we are going to keep company with the youngest of them, the fifth of the 6 women who married Henry VIII. A girl whose name you know, and whose true story you almost certainly do not. You have heard her, perhaps, as the foolish one, the frivolous one, the pretty young queen who threw away a crown and her life for the sake of a reckless love affair. That is how the centuries have remembered her, with a shake of the head and a clucking tongue, as a cautionary tale about vanity and folly. But the truth of her is something far sadder and far gentler than that hard old verdict, and far more deserving of our tenderness. For she was scarcely more than a child when all of this happened to her, a girl of some 18 or 19 brought up in neglect, used by the grown men and the ambitious relatives who should have safeguarded her, lifted up to a height she was in no way prepared for and had no power to refuse, and then destroyed, swiftly and without mercy, by the very people who had put her there. Tonight, slowly and kindly, we are going to give her back the truth, and look at her not as a foolish queen, but as a girl who never really had a chance, and who deserves, 500 years too late, a little of the gentleness that no one gave her in life. Before we go back to find her, let me say the small things I always like to say at the start. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are, whether there is rain at the window or snow on the sill or only the ordinary quiet of a late hour. If you find a kind of rest in these slow journeys into the past, then you are very welcome to subscribe, so that the next of these long evenings finds its way to you when you need one. And you are always welcome to leave a note in the comments, because I look through them often, and I am always moved by how a story so old and so distant can draw people together from every corner of the earth into the same hushed and shared and sleepy room at the close of the day. That is all. The lamp is low, the door is shut, and the night is yours. So let your shoulders drop, and let the day loosen its grip, and come back with me now to a large house in the English countryside, almost 500 years ago, where a little girl is growing up half forgotten among strangers. Picture this: a large and rambling country house in the green county of Sussex, in the south of England, in the years around 1530, its mellow brick warm in the afternoon light, its many chimneys rising over a huddle of steep roofs, its windows looking out across gardens and orchards toward the soft wooded hills beyond. It is called Chesworth, and it is the country seat of one of the grandest families in the land, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, the widowed head of a branch of the mighty Howard clan. The house is full to overflowing, for a noble woman of that age kept an enormous household, dozens upon dozens of servants and attendants, and hangers-on and poor relations, all of them lodged and fed beneath her roof, all of them part of her vast and sprawling establishment. There are grand chambers and humble ones, kitchens roaring with the work of feeding so many mouths, long galleries and a chapel and gardens, and somewhere in the crowded upper floors, among a crowd of gentlewomen, the maids and gentlewomen who fill such a household, there is a little girl, one among many easy to overlook. Her name is Catherine Howard, and though her blood is some of the grandest in England, no one is minding her very much at all, and that neglect, that simple, ordinary lack of anyone to truly watch over her, will shape and in the end destroy her whole short life. To understand Catherine, you have to understand the family she belonged to, because they were not an ordinary family, and being a Howard meant something very particular in the England of that age, both grand and dangerous in equal measure. The family was one of the foremost of the noble houses, Dukes of Norfolk, premier peers of the realm, a family of immense antiquity and pride and ambition, with royal blood in their veins and a hunger for power that never slept. They stood at the very summit of the old aristocracy, the leaders of the conservative nobility, proud and grasping and perpetually manoeuvring for advantage at the dangerous court of the Tudor king. And they had learned, this family, that one of the surest roads to power ran through the bedchamber of the king himself, that a pretty girl of the family, well placed and well coached, might catch the royal eye and carry the whole family up behind her into the sunlight of royal favour. They had done it once already, with spectacular and then catastrophic results, for Anne Boleyn, the second of Henry's wives, the one who had been crowned and then beheaded, was herself a Howard on her mother's side, a niece of the Duke of Norfolk, raised up by the family's ambition, and then destroyed when the king turned against her. You would think the family might have learned caution from that bloody lesson. But they had not. They were about to play the very same game again, with another of their girls, and it would end the very same way, on the very same scaffold, with another Howard niece kneeling before the executioner. Let me tell you more about the Howards, this family whose blood and ambition shaped and doomed Catherine, because they are one of the foremost dynasties of English history, and understanding them is essential to understanding her. The Howards had risen over the generations to the very summit of the English nobility, Dukes of Norfolk, the premier peers of the realm, a family of ancient lineage and immense pride that stood at the head of the old aristocracy. They had royal blood in their veins, descent from earlier kings, and they carried themselves with the haughty assurance of men who believed themselves the natural leaders of the kingdom, second only to the crown itself. They were also, by temperament and tradition, the leaders of the Conservative party at court, the foremost Catholic family that stood against the religious reformers, defenders of the old faith and the old order, and this placed them perpetually at the centre of the deadly factional struggles that defined the politics of Henry's reign. To be a Howard was to be born into the front rank of the kingdom, into wealth and power and privilege, but also into danger, into the merciless competition for the king's favour, where the stakes were always ultimately life and death. The head of the family in Catherine's time was her uncle Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, and he was one of the most formidable and least lovable men of his age, and it is worth pausing on him, for he is the architect of Catherine's rise, and in a sense of her destruction. Norfolk was a hard, cold, proud, and utterly ruthless man, a soldier and a politician of long experience, devoted above all things to the advancement of his family and the preservation of his own power. He had served the king faithfully and brutally for decades, crushing rebellions, sitting in judgment, manoeuvring endlessly through the treacherous currents of the court, and he had survived where others fell by a combination of ability, ruthlessness, and a willingness to sacrifice anyone, including his own kin, to save himself. This was the man who masterminded the placing of his niece in the king's path, who saw in his young niece an instrument for the family's advancement, and who would, when she fell, scramble frantically to distance himself from her, to save his own skin by abandoning the girl he had used. There was no warmth in Norfolk, no tenderness, no protective love for the vulnerable young relation he deployed and then discarded. There was only the cold calculation of family advantage, and Catherine was a counter to be played in his endless game of power. The family had played this very game before, and it had ended on the scaffold, and that is the most chilling thing about their willingness to play it again with Catherine. For Anne Boleyn, the second of Henry's wives, was herself a Howard on her mother's side, a niece of the same Duke of Norfolk, steered toward the throne by the same family ambition that would later raise Catherine. Anne had been crowned queen, had given the king a daughter, and had then been destroyed, accused of adultery and treason, and beheaded within the Tower, when the king tired of her and turned against her. Norfolk had presided over the trial that condemned his own niece, had pronounced the sentence of death upon her himself, sacrificing her without hesitation, when her fall became inevitable, choosing his own survival over any loyalty to his kin. You would think that a family which had seen one of its daughters raised to the throne and then beheaded might hesitate before steering another daughter down the same path. But the Howards did not hesitate. The lure of power through a queen of their own line was too strong, and the lessons of Anne's fall were set aside, and they pushed Catherine forward just as they had pushed Anne, with exactly the same cold ambition, toward the very same throne, and, in the end, the very same scaffold. There is something almost mythic in the doubling of it. The two Howard nieces, the two queens of the same line, the two paths to the same throne, and the same block. Anne and Catherine were cousins, the daughters of brother and sister, both raised up by Norfolk's scheming, both married to the same king, both accused of betraying him, both beheaded within the Tower, on the same ground, within 6 years of each other. It is as though the family was cursed to repeat its tragedy, to feed its daughters one after another into the same deadly machine, learning nothing, sacrificing each in turn to the same doomed pursuit of power through the royal bed. And she, the second of the pair, was in some ways the more pitiable, for she was younger and more helpless than Anne had been, less able to understand or navigate the danger, more purely a victim of the family's ambition. Anne had at least been a player in her own rise, clever and ambitious and active in pursuit of the crown. She was barely even that, a child swept along by her uncle's scheming, with no real understanding of the game she was a piece in. The Howard hunger that had merely used Anne simply consumed Catherine, and the family that should have been her protection was instead the instrument of her doom. Catherine's own standing in this proud family was a strange and telling one, for she was a Howard of the grandest blood and yet of the poorest fortune, born to a branch of the family that had all the pride of the name and almost none of its wealth. Her father was Lord Edmund Howard, a younger son of the old Duke of Norfolk, and the curse of being a younger son in that age was that the bulk of the inheritance passed almost entirely to the eldest, leaving the younger boys with the noble name and the noble pride but scant money to support it. Edmund Howard was, by every account, a feckless and perpetually impoverished man, forever in debt, forever begging his powerful relatives for places and pensions, scrambling all his life to keep up the appearance that his rank demanded on an income that could not begin to support it. He was the father of a good many children, too many for his slender means, and Catherine was one of the younger of them, born into genteel poverty, a daughter of a noble house that could not afford her. This is the first thing to understand about her, the strange combination that defined her from birth, the grandest of blood and the poorest of circumstances. A Howard who was also, in the practical business of daily life, a poor relation, dependent on the charity of richer kin. It is a combination that would carry her, eventually, all the way to a throne and then to a grave. Her mother was Joyce Culpeper, a gentlewoman of Kent who had been married before and brought children from that first marriage into her union with Edmund Howard, so that Catherine grew up among a tangle of half-siblings and full siblings, one small figure in a large and chaotic and impoverished brood. And her mother died when Catherine was still very young, a little girl, removing from her life the one person who might most naturally have watched over her and guided her and protected her through the dangerous business of growing up. This early loss matters enormously to her story, for it set the pattern of her whole childhood, which was a childhood without a mother's care, without steady guidance, without anyone whose particular charge it was to raise her well and keep her safe. Her father, struggling with his debts and his many children and his own feckless nature, was in no position to give her the attention she needed, and so the solution was the one that such families always reached for in such cases. The motherless girl, surplus to her impoverished father's slender means, was sent away to be raised in the household of a rich and powerful relative, packed off to live under the roof of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, to be brought up among the crowd of other young dependents who filled that sprawling establishment. And there, in that crowded and careless house, with no mother and no real guardian and no one to truly mind her, Catherine Howard's strange and tragic story truly begins. Let us think for a moment about the wider Howard family into which Catherine was born, the brothers and sisters and the scattered kin she grew up surrounded by, for it deepens the picture of her childhood and shows how thoroughly she was a product of a particular kind of impoverished gentility. Her father, Lord Edmund Howard, had been married more than once and had fathered so many offspring that Catherine grew up amid a large brood of siblings and half-siblings, a crowd of young Howards all sharing in the same genteel poverty, all bearing the proud name with little of the wealth that should have accompanied it. There were brothers who would have to make their own way in the world, seeking places and positions and advantageous marriages, scrambling as their father had scrambled to keep up the appearance their rank demanded on means that could not support it. There were sisters who, like Catherine, would need to be married off or placed in noble households, disposed of as the family's limited resources allowed. It was a large, chaotic, impoverished family, long on pride and short on money, and she was one child among many in it, easy to overlook, surplus to her father's straitened means. This abundance of offspring, this crowd of young Howards competing for the family's limited resources and attention, helps to explain why she was so readily sent away and so thoroughly neglected. A father with so many to provide for, and little money could not give each of them careful individual attention, could not afford to keep and raise them all under his own eye, and the solution for a daughter was the one that Catherine experienced, to be sent off to a richer relative's household, to be raised among the crowd of dependents there. She was not singled out for neglect through any particular cruelty. She was simply one of too many children of too poor a father, dispatched to the Dowager Duchess's establishment as a way of relieving her father of the burden of her keep, and giving her the chance of the upbringing and the eventual marriage that he could not himself provide. It was an ordinary arrangement, unremarkable in its way, the kind of thing that happened to many daughters of the poorer gentry. But for Catherine it meant a childhood without a parent's close care, lost in the crowd of a large household, and that ordinary, unremarkable neglect was the soil in which her tragedy took root. It is worth noting, too, how the fortunes of the wider family rose and fell with Catherine's own, how her brief elevation lifted her scattered kin, and her fall threatened to drag them down. When she became queen, her relatives shared in her sudden glory, for a queen could dispense favour and place and advancement to her family, and the various Howards and their connections benefited from having one of their own upon the throne. Generous and warm-hearted, she seems to have been glad to help her kin, to show favour to her family, to share the bounty of her position with the relatives who had been her companions in poverty. But when she fell, that same connection became a danger, and her relatives scrambled to distance themselves from the disgraced queen, to disavow any part in her crimes, to escape being dragged down in her ruin. Some of them, particularly those who had been part of the careless household where her early experiences had taken place, and who might be accused of having known and concealed them, were arrested and imprisoned, caught up in the spreading catastrophe of her fall. The family that had risen with her now scrambled to survive her, and most of them did, weathering the storm and going on with their lives, while Catherine herself, the one who had lifted them, and the one they abandoned, went to her death. There is something telling, and something sad, in the way the family closed ranks to protect itself and let Catherine fall, for it shows that even her own blood, even the kin she had helped and favoured, valued their own survival above any loyalty to her. The Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, led the way in this abandonment, but he was not alone, for the whole family instinct, in the crisis, was to save itself by sacrificing the one at the centre of the storm. She had been useful to them when she was rising, a source of favour and advancement, and they had been glad enough to share in her glory. But when she fell, she became a liability, a danger, a source of contamination to be escaped, and escaped her, abandoning the woman who had been their kinswoman and their benefactor to face her destruction alone. It is the final instance of the pattern that ran through her whole life, the pattern of being used by those who ought to have protected her and abandoned the moment she ceased to be useful. And it extended even to her own family, even to the blood relations who might have been expected to stand by her, and who instead, like everyone else in her short life, put their own interests first and left her to her fate. Here, the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, into which the motherless girl was sent, was a world unto itself, and to understand what became of Catherine, you have to understand the strange and careless nature of the place where she was raised. The Duchess was an old woman, the widow of a duke, and she presided over a vast establishment divided between her country house at Chesworth in Sussex and her residence at Lambeth, across the river from London. Such a household was, in that age, a sort of finishing school and holding pen combined, where the daughters of the family's poorer branches and connections were sent to be brought up in a manner befitting their rank, to learn the accomplishments and manners of gentlewomen, and to wait, in genteel idleness, until marriages could be arranged for them. There were many such gentlewomen under the Duchess's roof, a whole crowd of girls and young gentlewomen, lodged together in the upper chambers, and they were, by every indication, very loosely supervised indeed. The Duchess was old and grand, and largely indifferent to the daily lives of the swarm of dependents beneath her roof, and the women in her care were left, for the most part, to their own devices, sleeping together in a common chamber, passing their days with little structure and less discipline, and their nights, it would emerge, with almost no supervision at all. Let me take you properly inside the world of Catherine's girlhood, into the sprawling household of the Duchess where she was raised, because it was a world utterly unlike anything we know, and the strange careless nature of it is the key to all that followed. A great noblewoman of that age did not live as a private person in a private home. She lived at the head of a vast establishment, a household of dozens upon dozens of people, a small kingdom of its own with its own hierarchy and its own rhythms and its own crowded common life. There were the upper servants, gentlemen and gentlewomen of good birth, who served the lady of the house in positions of relative dignity. There were the lower servants, the cooks and grooms and laundresses and scullions, who did the heavy work of feeding and maintaining so large a company. There were the poor relations and dependents, the children of the family's lesser branches sent to be raised under that lady's roof, of whom Catherine was one. And all of them lived together beneath a single roof, or rather between the two houses the Duchess kept, the country seat at Chesworth and the riverside mansion at Lambeth, a press of humanity crowded together in the rambling chambers of a noble establishment. For the women of such a household, the unmarried gentlewomen and poor relations like Catherine, life centred on the maiden's chamber, the common dormitory where they slept together, a long room full of beds where the women of the household passed their nights. And it is here, in the slack management of this crowded chamber, that we find the root of Catherine's tragedy, for the maiden's chamber was very loosely supervised indeed. The gentlewomen were meant to be locked in at night, watched over, kept safe and separate, as the honour of a noble household required. But in the Duchess's establishment, this supervision was lax to the point of negligence. The chamber was not properly secured, the women came and went with scant oversight, and at night, when the household should have been at rest, there was a good deal of coming and going, of visiting and merriment and worse, that no one of authority troubled to prevent. The old Duchess was grand and remote and largely indifferent to the nighttime doings of the swarm of young people beneath her roof, and the result was a kind of unsupervised freedom that was extremely dangerous for the girls left exposed to it. Picture the reality of it for one like Catherine, growing up in this crowded and careless place. She slept in a common chamber with a crowd of other gentlewomen, with little privacy and little protection. Her days were passed in the idle round of a noble household, learning some music and dancing and needlework, but with no real education and no serious discipline, left largely to amuse herself among her companions. And her nights in that poorly guarded chamber were exposed to exactly the dangers that a properly run household existed to prevent. There was feasting and merriment after dark, young men finding their way into the maiden's chamber, gifts and flirtations and intrigues conducted in the lax freedom of a place where no one was truly watching. For one unprotected, motherless and unguarded, growing up in this atmosphere of unsupervised license, the dangers were obvious and grave, and they were dangers that the adults responsible for her did nothing to shield her from. She was, in the most literal sense, left exposed, a vulnerable child in a heedless house, prey to whoever might take advantage of the negligence that surrounded her. And this is the world that formed Catherine, that shaped her expectations and her conduct and her understanding of how the world worked, and it is worth dwelling on because it explains so much about what came later. A young person raised in such a place where the boundaries were so loose and the supervision so absent, where flirtation and intrigue were the ordinary texture of nighttime life, would naturally absorb a set of assumptions about conduct that were entirely unsuited to the deadly seriousness of the royal court. She had grown up in a world where such things were winked at, where the loose freedom of the maiden's chamber carried no apparent consequences, and she carried that careless understanding with her, fatally, into a setting where the same conduct would cost her life. It was not that Catherine was wicked or wanton by nature. It was that she had been raised in a neglectful place by heedless people, and had learned heedless habits, and was then thrust into the most dangerous and watchful court in Europe, without ever understanding that the rules had utterly changed, that what had been winked at in the Duchess's chamber would be punished with death in the palace of the king. The negligence of her upbringing did not merely expose her to exploitation as a child. It also failed to teach her the caution that might have saved her as a woman, and in that double failure lay the seeds of her destruction. This is the crucial fact about her upbringing, the fact from which everything else flows, and it is a fact not of wickedness but of neglect. She was not brought up badly in the sense of being cruelly treated. She was raised badly in the sense of being barely raised at all, left to grow up half wild in a crowded house where no one of authority took any real interest in her welfare, her education, or her conduct. She received scant formal education, learning to read and write only haltingly, never given the careful intellectual training that some gentlewomen of the age enjoyed. She learned music, a little, and dancing, and the surface accomplishments of a young lady, but of moral guidance, of the close watchful care that a child most needs, of anyone whose particular duty and love it was to shield her and form her and prepare her safely for the world. She had almost nothing. She was one of many in a careless house, and the grown-ups who should have been watching over her were not watching at all. And into that vacuum of supervision, into that unwatched and unguarded space where she was growing up with no one truly minding her, came the people who would exploit her, the older figures who would take advantage of exactly the neglect that surrounded her, and begin the chain of events that would one day cost Catherine her life. For we must speak now carefully and with the gravity it deserves of what happened to her in that negligent household, because it is central to her tale, and it has too often been told wrongly, as though it were her sin rather than the wrong done to her. While she was still in her early adolescence, a child really, Catherine became the object of unwanted attention from older males within the household, men who held positions of relative authority and who used the lack of supervision around her to pursue a vulnerable child in their care. The first of these was her music teacher, a man named Henry Manox, employed to instruct the women in the household and who, by his own later admission, set himself to pursue her when she was far too young, a girl of maybe 13. That a grown man employed to teach her should instead have pursued her tells you all we need know about the failure of that household to protect her, and nothing whatever against Catherine, who was the one wronged here, the one who should have been guarded and was not. We shall not dwell on the details, for they do not deserve dwelling on, and the girl at the centre of them deserves her dignity. It is enough to say that an adult in a position of trust exploited a neglected girl, and that the household which should have prevented it did nothing because no one was paying attention. The second figure was a courtier named Francis Dereham, a gentleman of the Duchess's household, older than Catherine, who formed an attachment to her when she was still very young, in the years after the business with the music teacher. This relationship was more serious and more lasting, and it would prove in the end the more dangerous of the two, for it was conducted with a degree of seriousness that some would later argue amounted to a kind of informal betrothal, a promise of marriage between them. Again, we need not and will not dwell on the particulars. What matters for Catherine's story is the simple shape of the thing, that an unprotected child, growing up without a mother or any guardian who truly cared for her, in a household where the older people charged with her welfare were entirely negligent, formed in her early youth attachments that were entirely a product of that neglect. Attachments with older figures who took advantage of her unguarded situation. These were not the calculated sins of a wanton woman, as the cruel later legend would paint them. They were the entirely predictable consequence of leaving a vulnerable child unsupervised among adults who would exploit her. The fault lay with the grown-ups who failed her, with the careless duchess and the negligent household and the absent father, not with the girl herself. But it would be the girl herself who paid for it, years later, with her life, when these buried episodes of her unprotected childhood were dug up and turned into the weapons that destroyed her. Now the wheel of the family's ambition began to turn, and it turned, as it always did, toward the court and the king. By the closing years of the 1530s, the central question at the heart of English politics was once again the question of the king's marriage, for Henry, having lost his beloved third wife Jane Seymour to the childbed, had taken a fourth, the German Princess Anne of Cleves, in a match that everyone could see was failing almost before it had begun. The king could not bear his new foreign wife, was casting about already for a way to be rid of her, and the powerful families of the court watched this unfolding disaster with the keen attention of predators scenting opportunity. For if the king were to set aside Anne of Cleves, he would need a new object for his affections, and the family that could place the right girl in his path stood to gain everything. And the Howards, that proud and grasping clan, looked about them for a suitable candidate to dangle before the aging king, and their eye fell upon their own poor relation, now grown into a pretty and lively and charming young woman, and they saw in her exactly the instrument they needed. It was the Duke of Norfolk himself, Catherine's uncle, the head of the family, and one of the most powerful and ruthless men in England, who led the scheme, as he had once helped to advance his other niece, Anne Boleyn, toward the throne. The plan was simple, and it was cynical, and it had worked before. She would be placed at court, given a position in the household of the new queen, Anne of Cleves, where she would be constantly in the king's sight, and there, prettily dressed and carefully coached, she would be steered into the path of the royal wandering eye in the hope that he would be captivated. She was perfect for the purpose, from the family's cold point of view, young and fresh and pretty and charming, with the lively gaiety of her youth, all that might appeal to a heavy aging king grown weary of his unwanted foreign wife. That she was barely more than a child, that she had no preparation for the deadly game she was being entered into, that the last Howard girl steered into the king's bed had ended on the scaffold. None of this gave the family the slightest pause. That they wanted power, and Catherine was their means to it, and so the pretty poor relation was dressed up and sent to court to be used. And so she came to court, around the end of the year 1539 or the beginning of 1540, placed as a maid of honour in the household of the new queen, Anne of Cleves, the very woman she was being lined up to replace. Imagine the bewilderment and the wonder of it for a girl who had grown up half forgotten in the crowded chambers of a country house, suddenly transported to the dazzling and terrifying centre of the kingdom, to the court of Henry VIII, in all its glittering magnificence and all its deadly intrigue. The court was a world of overwhelming splendour, of cloth of gold and rich tapestry and music and dancing and feasting, the most brilliant society in England, and for a poor relation raised in neglect it must have seemed like stepping into a dream. But it was also the most dangerous setting in the kingdom, a viper's nest of ambition and faction and watchfulness, where a single misstep could destroy you, where queens were beheaded and ministers sent to the block, and into this place the young and undereducated and unworldly Catherine was dropped with no real understanding of its perils, a girl entirely unequipped for the role her family had assigned her, a lamb sent in among wolves who happened to be her own relations. Before we follow her into the dazzling danger of the court, let us take a moment to understand the country and the age she lived in, for the England of her short life was a place in the throes of upheaval, and the storms of that age would help to destroy her. The England of 1540 was a kingdom transformed, and still transforming, by the vast religious revolution that Henry VIII had set in motion. Only a few years before, the king had broken England away from the Church of Rome, casting off the authority of the Pope and making himself the supreme head of the Church in his own realm, all so that he might set aside his first wife and marry Anne Boleyn. From that fateful break had flowed a torrent of change that was still surging through the country in Catherine's day. The monasteries, the ancient religious houses that had stood across the land for centuries, were being dissolved and destroyed, their wealth seized by the crown, their communities scattered, their buildings stripped and left to crumble. The old certainties of 1,000 years of Catholic faith were being torn up, and the country was divided, often bitterly, between those who welcomed the religious changes and those who clung to the old ways. This religious division was not merely a matter of private conscience. It was the central political fault line of the age, the axis around which the deadly factional struggles of the court revolved, and it bears directly on Catherine's fate. The court was split between two parties, the reformers who pushed for further religious change toward the new Protestant ideas, and the conservatives who sought to defend what remained of the old Catholic faith and order. These two factions struggled endlessly for control of the king and the kingdom, and their struggle was a matter of life and death, for to lose was often to be destroyed, accused of treason or heresy and sent to the block or the stake. The Howards, Catherine's family, were the leaders of the conservative Catholic party, and their fortunes rose and fell with the endless seesaw of factional advantage. When Catherine became queen, it was a triumph for the conservative Howards and a defeat for the reformers, and it gave the reformers a powerful motive to destroy her, for in destroying the queen they could strike a blow against the whole conservative faction. She, who understood nothing of politics and cared nothing for religion, was nonetheless a piece on this deadly board, and her fall would be, in part, a move in the factional game engineered by the reformers who hated her family. The court at the heart of this divided and dangerous kingdom was the most glittering and most perilous place in England, and it was the whole world of Catherine's brief queenship. It was not a single fixed place, but a vast travelling household of more than 1,000 people, moving with the king between his many palaces, Greenwich and Hampton Court and Whitehall and Windsor and the rest, following the seasons and fleeing the plague that emptied London in the warm months. It was a scene of overwhelming magnificence, of cloth of gold and rich tapestry and jewels and music and feasting, the centre of all power and wealth and fashion in the kingdom, where the highest of the realm gathered to bask in the warmth of royal favour. And it was, beneath that dazzling surface, a scene of deadly danger, a viper's nest of ambition and intrigue and watchfulness, where every smile might hide a knife, where factions schemed endlessly against one another, where a single misstep or a single enemy's whisper could bring catastrophe. To rise at court was to gain everything, wealth and power and honour. To fall was to lose everything, often including your life, and the higher you rose, the further you had to fall, and no one at that court stood higher, or more precariously, than the Queen. Into this world, this brilliant and lethal court at the heart of a kingdom torn by religious revolution, the young and unworldly Catherine was thrust, with no understanding of its dangers, and no one to guide her safely through them. She did not grasp the factional struggles that swirled around her, did not understand that her elevation had made her a target for her family's enemies, did not comprehend that the dazzling court was also a killing ground where queens before her had been destroyed. She saw only the splendour, the dancing and the jewels and the gaiety, the surface glitter of the most magnificent court in Europe, and she delighted in it with the innocent joy of a girl given the run of a treasure house. She did not see, could not see, the watching eyes, the scheming enemies, the deadly machinery that stood ready to grind her up the moment she gave it cause. She was a child playing happily in a place full of hidden traps, and the adults who had put her there, her ambitious family, cared only for the advantage she brought them, and not at all for the dangers that surrounded her. It was the old pattern of her life once more, the unguarded girl in the dangerous setting, only now the dangerous setting was the court of a king who killed his queens, and the price of being unguarded would be everything. She was, by every account, an immediate and charming presence at court, this fresh girl with her lively manner and her prettiness and her evident delight in the finery and the dancing and the gaiety of court life. She loved to dance, loved fine clothes and jewels, loved the music and the pleasure and the colour of the glittering world she had been thrust into, and there was something genuinely appealing in her youthful vivacity, her warmth, her artless enjoyment of it all. She was not clever in the way her cousin Anne Boleyn had been clever, not learned or witty or sharp, for her neglected upbringing had given her none of those accomplishments. But she had youth and prettiness and charm and a sweet, generous, pleasure-loving nature, and at the court of an ageing king grown heavy and sick and sour, that fresh young charm was a powerful thing. The family had chosen their instrument well. It was not long at all before the thing they had schemed for came to pass, before the king's heavy, wandering, hungry eye fell upon the pretty young maid of honour, who had been so carefully placed in his path, and lit up with the particular desperate ardour of an old man dazzled by youth. Let me show you what Catherine's daily life was actually like in those first months at court, before the king's eye fell upon her, when she was simply one of the maids of honour in the household of Queen Anne of Cleves, for the life of a maid of honour was a particular and a demanding thing, and it placed her at the very centre of the dangerous world she did not understand. A maid of honour was a young unmarried gentlewoman who attended upon the Queen, one of the band of well-born girls who formed the female society around the throne, and the position was both a privilege and a sort of performance that never ended. The maids served the Queen in her daily round, helping to dress and attend her, accompanying her through her days, sitting with her at her needlework and her devotions, forming the decorative and dutiful retinue that a queen's dignity required. and in the evenings at the court entertainments they were on display, expected to dance gracefully, to make pleasant conversation, to be ornaments of the court's magnificence, for the women attending her were part of the glittering spectacle of royal life, and part, too, of the marriage market through which noble families arranged the advancement of their daughters. For a girl like Catherine, fresh from the obscurity of the Duchess's household, the life of a maid of honour must have been a dazzling and intoxicating thing. Suddenly she was at the very centre of the kingdom, lodged in the royal palaces, clothed in finery befitting her position, surrounded by the wealth and beauty and excitement of the most magnificent court in Europe. She who had grown up a poor relation, in hand-me-down clothes among the crowd of dependents, was now a gentlewoman of the Queen's own household, moving in the highest circles of the land, within sight of the king himself. The dancing, the music, the gorgeous clothes, the handsome young men of the court, the endless round of entertainment and display, all of it must have seemed like a dream to a girl who had known only neglect and genteel poverty. And Catherine, with her pleasure-loving nature and her delight in finery and gaiety, threw herself into this glittering life with evident joy, blossoming in the warmth of attention and admiration, a pretty creature in her element at last. But the life of a maid of honour was also a perilous one, surrounded by dangers that a wiser and better guided girl would have navigated with care, and Catherine had neither the wisdom nor the guidance to navigate them safely. A young woman at court lived constantly on display, her reputation under perpetual scrutiny, her conduct watched by 1,000 eyes, and her good name was her most precious and most fragile possession. The men of the court pursued the women relentlessly, in the elaborate and often insincere language of courtly flirtation, and a maid of honour had to navigate this attention with real skill, accepting admiration without surrendering her virtue, charming without compromising her reputation, for a single scandal could ruin her prospects forever. This was a game that required worldliness, self-command, and careful judgment, and Catherine, raised in sheer neglect, possessed none of these qualities. She had grown up in a household where exactly such flirtations were winked at, where the boundaries were loose and the supervision absent, and she carried those careless habits into the infinitely more dangerous setting of the court, where the same conduct could be fatal. And it was in this setting, this glittering and perilous world of the Queen's household, that she first came under the notice of the king, and the manner of it tells us much about how the whole tragedy was set in motion. For the king, in those months, was a frequent presence in the household of his new queen, Anne of Cleves, even as his marriage to her was failing and his discontent with her growing. And as he moved through the queen's apartments, his heavy aging eye fell upon the women who attended her, the pretty maids of honour, and among them upon the fresh and lively Catherine, carefully placed there by her scheming family for exactly this purpose. The Howards had positioned their girl precisely where the king would see her, in the household of the very wife he was tiring of, calculating that her youth and prettiness would draw his wandering eye, and the calculation proved exactly correct. The king noticed her, and noticing her, desired her, and desiring her, set in motion the chain of events that would make her queen and then destroy her. She had come to court a poor relation, seeking only the ordinary advancement of a good marriage, and instead she had been deliberately dangled before him, and he had taken the bait, and the trap, though she did not know it, had begun to close around her. Today, to understand what now happened, you have to see the king as he truly was in the year 1540, and to feel the strangeness, even the grotesqueness, of the match that was being arranged. Henry VIII was approaching 50, and the golden prince of his youth was long gone, buried beneath the wreck of what he had become. He was enormously fat now, his body swollen and unwieldy, straining the specially made chairs and beds that had to bear his weight. He suffered from a terrible ulcer on his leg, an open and suppurating wound that would not heal, that caused him constant pain, and that by some accounts gave off a foul smell that announced his presence. He was aging, ailing, often in agony, his temper soured into suspicion and sudden cruelty, a dangerous and frightening man who had already cast off 2 wives and beheaded one of them, and was even now arranging to discard a 4th. This was the man, heavy and sick and nearly 50, whose desire now fastened upon a girl of 16 or 17, young enough to be his daughter, indeed young enough to be his granddaughter. There is something genuinely disturbing in the picture, and we should not look away from it. The ruined old king and the child bride, the vast ailing body and the fresh girl, and we should hold it in mind as a corrective to any romantic notion of this match. It was not a love story. It was an old and powerful man's desire for a girl, and she had no real means to refuse. We must look more closely at the king himself, at Henry VIII as he truly was in these years, because the man Catherine married was a figure of genuine horror beneath the royal magnificence, and understanding what he had become deepens both the strangeness of the match and the helplessness of one caught in it. Cast your mind back, first, to what Henry had once been, for the contrast is part of the tragedy. In his youth he had been one of the marvels of Europe, a golden prince, tall and powerfully built and strikingly handsome, an athlete and huntsman and jouster of tireless energy, a musician and scholar of real accomplishment, charming and magnificent and adored. That had been the Henry of 30 years before, the golden king of his bright morning. But 3 decades of power, indulgence and disappointment had wrought a terrible transformation, and the man who married Catherine bore almost no resemblance to that golden youth. By the time he took Catherine to wife, Henry was approaching 50 and had become a kind of ruin of his former self. He had grown grossly fat, his once athletic body swollen to an enormous and unhealthy bulk, so heavy that he could barely move without assistance in his later years, requiring mechanical devices to be hauled upstairs, his vast frame straining the reinforced furniture made specially to bear him. He was tormented by a chronic ulcer on his leg, a deep and suppurating wound that would not heal, which caused him constant and sometimes agonizing pain, which periodically closed up and brought on dangerous fevers, and which, by many accounts, gave off so foul an odour that it could be detected at a distance. The pain and the illness and the long years of absolute power had transformed his character as surely as they had transformed his body, souring the charm of his youth into suspicion, self-pity, and sudden murderous cruelty. He had become a tyrant in the fullest sense, capable of destroying anyone who crossed or disappointed him, his favour a thing of terror because it could turn without warning into deadly wrath. He had already cast aside 2 wives and beheaded a 3rd, broken his greatest ministers, executed old friends and faithful servants, and drowned rebellions in blood. To note, this was the man, aging and gross and ailing and dangerous, whose desire fastened upon a girl of 16 or 17, and we should not let the romantic language of the rose without a thorn obscure the genuine grotesqueness of the situation. Here was a vast, sick, aging tyrant, his body ruined and malodorous, his temper murderous, decades older than his bride, fixing his hungry desire upon a child young enough to be his granddaughter. There was nothing romantic in it, whatever the king himself may have felt. It was the desire of a powerful old man for a girl, a desire she had no power to refuse, backed by all the terrifying authority of a king who killed those who displeased him. For Catherine, the physical reality of the marriage, of being bound to this ruined and ailing man, of performing the duties of a wife to him, must have been a thing of quiet horror, however she may have valued the crown and the jewels. We need not dwell on it, for it belongs to her and we owe her her dignity, but we should hold it honestly in mind the true nature of the union beneath its gilded surface, the girl and the ruined tyrant, for it is essential to understanding both her loneliness and the fatal recklessness with which she would later reach for the warmth of someone her own age. And we should understand, too, the particular danger that the king's nature posed to a wife who might disappoint or betray him, for Henry's history with his wives was a history written in rejection and blood. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who had been a faithful and devoted queen for over 20 years, he had cast aside without mercy when she could not give him a son, and he desired another woman, stripping her of her title and banishing her to a lonely death. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, he had destroyed utterly, accusing her of adultery and treason on evidence that was almost certainly fabricated, and sending her to the scaffold when he tired of her and wanted Jane Seymour. He had shown, in other words, that there was no limit to what he would do to a wife who ceased to please him, that he could move from love to murder with terrifying speed, that the women he married held their position and their lives entirely at the mercy of his shifting desire and his merciless will. She, marrying this man, was placing herself in the power of a husband who had already killed a wife, and any betrayal of him, any failure, any scandal would be punished not with divorce or disgrace, but with death. She does not seem to have understood this in her youth and her unworldliness, but it was the central and deadly fact of her marriage, and it would, in the end, destroy her. For Henry fell, and he fell hard, with all the desperate intensity of an aging man who sees in a lover the illusion of his own lost youth. Catherine's fresh prettiness, her youth, her lively gaiety, her sweetness, all of it enchanted the worn and ailing king, and he pursued her with the heavy ardour of an old man infatuated, showering her with gifts and attentions and favour, his desire for her growing by the day. He called her his rose without a thorn, this fresh flower who had bloomed so unexpectedly in the autumn of his life, and he seemed to find in her a sort of late renewal, a last chance at the youthful joy and desire that his ruined body had long since put beyond his reach. To the king, Catherine was a tonic, a delight, a sweet creature who made him feel for a brief while young and vigorous and desired again, and he wanted her with an intensity that brooked no obstacle. And the Howard family, watching their scheme unfold exactly as they had hoped, pushed the girl forward eagerly, coaching her, dressing her, encouraging the king's desire, playing the old game of advancement through a daughter's body with the same cynical calculation that had once raised Anne Boleyn and would now raise Catherine. And she herself, the girl at the centre of all this, could do nothing, had no say in the matter at all. Almost none. And this is the heart of the tragedy, and the heart of why she deserves our compassion rather than our scorn. She was undereducated and unworldly, with no mother and no real guardian to advise or protect her, entirely under the authority of the dominant family that was using her. When the King of England, the most powerful and dangerous man in the realm, fixed his desire upon you, and when your own family, your formidable uncle the Duke, and the grand relatives whose charity you depended on, pushed you eagerly toward him, a girl of 16 had no power whatever to say no, none at all. She was swept along by forces vastly greater than herself, by the king's desire and her family's ambition, two of the most overwhelming currents in the kingdom, both of them bearing her toward the throne whether she willed it or not. She may well have been dazzled by it all, by the king's favour and the gorgeous gifts and the prospect of becoming queen, for she was young and pleasure-loving, and could hardly have grasped the deadly danger of the height she was being raised to. But dazzled or frightened or simply helpless, she had no real choice in the matter. The marriage was arranged for her by the king who wanted her and the family who used her, and the girl herself was carried along to it like a leaf on a flood. It is worth pausing to understand how a girl like Catherine came to be queen at all, the strange machinery of royal marriage that picked her up and carried her to the throne, because it reveals how little the woman herself mattered in the cold calculations that decided such things. Royal and noble marriages in that age were not affairs of love or even of personal choice. They were arrangements of state and family, negotiated for reasons of power, alliance, wealth, and dynasty, with the bride and groom often having little say in the matter. A king chose a wife for reasons of foreign alliance or domestic politics, or the need for heirs, or, in Henry's later years, increasingly for his own personal desire. And the foremost families of the kingdom competed fiercely to place their daughters in the path of that royal choice. For a daughter who became queen carried her whole family up with her into the heights of power and favour. The marriage of a king was the greatest prize in the kingdom's endless game of advancement, and the families that could influence it would do almost anything to win. The Howards understood this game better than anyone, for they had played it before, and their placing of Catherine was a calculated move in it, cold and deliberate, and entirely indifferent to the girl's own welfare. They saw that the king's marriage to Anne of Cleves was failing, that he would soon need a new wife, and they determined to ensure that the new wife would be one of their own, a Howard girl who would carry the family back to the summit of power. Catherine was their chosen instrument, selected not for any quality of her own beyond her youth and prettiness, but for her usefulness as bait for the king's desire. They placed her in the queen's household, where the king would see her. They coached her in how to behave. They dressed her to display her charms. They encouraged and managed the king's growing interest, orchestrating the whole courtship with the practiced skill of a family that had done this before. Catherine was not a person to them in this calculation, but a counter, a piece to be played, a means to the end of family advancement, and her own feelings and her own welfare entered into their schemes, not at all. And here we come to the cruelest aspect of the whole business, which is how little choice she herself had in any of it. We are accustomed to think of marriage as a matter of consent, of a woman choosing or at least accepting her husband, but Catherine's situation made any real consent impossible. She was young, perhaps 16, undereducated and unworldly, with no mother and no protector, entirely dependent on and subordinate to the powerful family that was using her. When the King of England desired her, and when her formidable uncle, the Duke, and the whole weight of her family pushed her toward him, she had no possible means to refuse. To say no to the king was unthinkable, dangerous in itself. To defy her family, on whom she depended utterly, was equally impossible. She was caught between two overwhelming forces, the king's desire and her family's ambition, and both of them were pushing her in the same direction, toward the throne, and she had neither the standing nor the strength, or perhaps even the understanding to resist. She was carried to her marriage not by her own choice but by the will of others, a girl swept along by the schemes of the powerful, with no more say in her fate than a pawn has in the game it is played in. This absence of choice is essential to understanding Catherine's whole tragedy, and to seeing why the old verdict of folly and wickedness is so unjust. She did not scheme her way to the throne, did not pursue the crown through her own ambition, did not choose the dangerous height she was raised to. She was placed there by others, against any real exercise of her own will, used as an instrument of her family's advancement, and the object of an old king's desire. And having been placed there without her real consent, by forces she could not resist, she was then held to the most merciless account for her conduct in a position she had never sought and was never equipped to fill. There is a deep injustice in this, in raising a girl to a dangerous height for the benefit of others, and then destroying her when she failed to bear the burden they had placed upon her. Catherine was set up to fail in a sense, given a role she was wholly unready for and no power to refuse, and then punished with death when she failed in it. The responsibility for that failure lies far less with the unprepared girl than with the dominant adults who placed her where she could not safely stand, and who abandoned her the moment she fell. The way was cleared with remarkable speed. The king's unwanted fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled in July of 1540, dissolved with the gracious cooperation of Anne herself, who was wise enough to accept her dismissal and was rewarded with wealth and honour and a long, safe life. And with Anne set aside, the king was free to take his fresh young bride, and he did so almost at once, with an eagerness that brooked no delay. Henry married her in late July of 1540. Quietly, the aging king and the teenage girl joined in a union that the whole court had watched being arranged. And the date of that wedding carries one of the grimmest ironies in all of this grim story. For on the very same day that the king married his young new queen, or within a day or two of it, his chief minister Thomas Cromwell, the man who had arranged the Cleves marriage and fallen with its failure, was beheaded on Tower Hill. So Catherine's married life as queen began, quite literally, in the shadow of the scaffold, her wedding and a man's execution falling together on the same dark day, an omen, had anyone wished to read it, of how her own brief reign would end. And so the poor relation from the crowded chambers of Chesworth became, in the summer of 1540, the Queen of England, raised in the space of a few months from a half-forgotten dependent to the First Lady of the kingdom, the wife of its king. Let us pause and picture her in her new glory, this girl of barely 17 suddenly clothed in all the magnificence that a queen commanded. She had her own household now, her ladies and her servants and her officers, her apartments in all the royal palaces hung with rich tapestry and furnished with every luxury. She had jewels, magnificent jewels, the king delighting in heaping treasures upon his young bride, gowns of cloth of gold and silver, furs and silks and every finery a girl could dream of. For a woman who loved beautiful things, who had grown up poor among the cast-off finery of richer relations, it must have been intoxicating beyond imagining, this sudden plunge into limitless luxury, this transformation from neglected poor relation to bejewelled queen. And she threw herself into it with all the delight of her pleasure-loving nature, loving the dancing and the music and the gorgeous clothes, surrounding herself with gaiety and colour, a girl playing at being a queen with evident and innocent joy. It is worth understanding what Catherine's marriage meant beyond the personal, what it represented in the larger game of faction and power that consumed the court, for her brief reign was, among other things, a political event of real importance, the triumph of one party and the alarm of another. When the king married Catherine, the conservative Catholic faction led by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, rose to the summit of its fortunes, for they now had one of their own family upon the throne, a Howard Queen, and the influence that flowed from such a connection was immense. The marriage seemed to mark a turning of the tide in the long religious struggle, a setback for the reformers who had been in the ascendant under the fallen minister Cromwell, and a corresponding rise for the conservatives who hoped, through their influence over the king, to slow or even reverse the religious changes that had transformed the kingdom. For a season, the Howards and their party stood higher than they had in years, basking in the warmth of royal favour, their enemies in retreat, their fortunes seemingly secure, all on the strength of the girl they had placed in the king's bed. But this political dimension of Catherine's marriage carried within it a deadly danger, one that the girl herself can hardly have understood, for it meant that she had enemies, powerful enemies, who had every reason to wish her destroyed. The reformers, pushed back by the conservative ascendancy that Catherine's marriage represented, had a strong motive to bring her down, for in destroying the Howard Queen they could strike a heavy blow against the whole Howard faction and reverse the political tide that had turned against them. Catherine was, whether she knew it or not, a piece on the factional board, a symbol of conservative power, and her enemies watched her closely, waiting for any weapon they could use against her. She was not merely a wife whose conduct mattered only to her husband. She was a political figure, the embodiment of a faction's triumph, and her fall would be a political event, eagerly desired and ruthlessly pursued by those whose interests her marriage had damaged. The recklessness of her private conduct gave those enemies exactly the weapon they sought, but the eagerness with which it was seized owed as much to politics as to morality, to the reformers' hunger to bring down the Howards, as to any genuine concern for the king's honour. This is part of why Catherine's fall, when it came, was so swift and so total, for she was destroyed not only by her own folly and the king's wounded pride, but by the active malice of a faction that wanted her gone. The information about her past, when it surfaced, found its way quickly into the hands of those who would use it. The reformers around Cranmer, who saw in it the means to destroy the Howard Queen and with her the Howard ascendancy. The investigation was pursued with a vigour that owed much to political motive, for those conducting it understood that the Queen's destruction would shift the balance of power at court, would topple the Conservatives and raise the Reformers, would change the whole political weather of the kingdom. Catherine, the girl who cared nothing for politics or religion, who wanted only to dance and wear fine clothes and enjoy her youth, was caught in the middle of a deadly political struggle, destroyed in part because her marriage had made her the symbol of a faction her enemies were determined to bring down. She fell in the end, not only as a foolish wife, but as a casualty of the endless war between the parties, a war she did not understand and had no wish to be part of, but which consumed her nonetheless. And the political consequences of her fall played out exactly as her enemies had hoped, for her destruction did indeed shift the balance of power, dealing a heavy blow to the Conservative Howards and clearing the way for the Reformers to recover their influence. The Duke of Norfolk, who had risen so high on his niece's marriage, now suffered a sharp reverse, his family disgraced, his enemies triumphant, the political tide turning once more against the Conservatives. The king's next and final marriage to Catherine Parr would be to a woman of reforming sympathies, a sign of how thoroughly the wheel had turned, how completely the conservative moment that Catherine's marriage had represented had passed. The young queen's fall, in other words, was not merely a personal tragedy, but a political turning point, a move in the larger game that reshaped the balance of power at court and influenced the religious direction of the kingdom. Catherine had been raised up as an instrument of her family's political ambition, and she was destroyed, in part, as a casualty of her family's political enemies, used by faction in her rise and consumed by faction in her fall. A girl who never understood the game, but who was, from beginning to end, a piece in it, moved and then sacrificed by forces far greater than herself. There is something both charming and heartbreaking in the picture of her brief queenship, in the sight of this girl revelling in her sudden splendour, all unaware of the precipice she stood upon. She was not, by any account, a political queen, not a woman who meddled in affairs of state or pursued any agenda beyond the enjoyment of her position. She was too young, too undereducated, too unworldly for any of that. She was simply a girl who loved pretty things and pleasure and gaiety, suddenly given the means to indulge all of it, and she did, with a guileless delight that the cynical court watched with varying degrees of indulgence and contempt. She was generous, too, kind-hearted in the heedless way of the young, fond of giving gifts and showing favour, and she seems to have been genuinely liked by many for her sweetness and her warmth. But she was utterly out of her depth, a child playing in the most dangerous court in Europe, with no understanding of its perils, and no one truly looking out for her, exactly as no one had truly looked out for her in all the years of her neglected childhood. The setting had changed, from the careless country house to the glittering palace, but the essential fact of Catherine's life had not. She was still a girl left unguarded in a dangerous place, still without anyone whose real care it was to protect her. And now the dangerous place was the court of a murderous king, and the stakes were not her reputation, but her life. Let me bring you back, before the darkness of the ending closes in entirely, to the brief bright days of Catherine's queenship, to the texture of her life in those few months when she was queen and happy and all unaware of what was coming, for there is a tenderness owed to those days, the last truly happy time of her short life. Picture her in her queen's apartments, in the royal palaces, surrounded by the magnificence that her position commanded. She had her own grand household, dozens of servants and attendants and ladies, a whole establishment devoted to her service and her comfort. Her rooms were hung with rich tapestries and warmed by roaring fires, lit by the best wax candles, furnished with every luxury the age could provide. She had her ladies to attend her, to dress her and accompany her, and keep her company through her days, and among them, fatally, were some of the very women who had known her in the buried years, and some, like Lady Rochford, who would help to destroy her. But in those early happy months, before the shadows gathered, the Queen's apartments were a scene of gaiety and pleasure, the Queen presiding over her little court with delight, and the finery, the gorgeous clothes and the jewels, which Catherine loved above almost anything, were lavished upon her in abundance. The king, in his infatuation, delighted in adorning his wife, and he heaped upon her treasures beyond counting, gowns of cloth of gold and silver, rich furs and jewels, magnificent jewels, ropes of pearls and precious stones, brooches and pendants and rings, the accumulated treasures of the crown, poured out upon the girl who had grown up a poor relation in hand-me-down clothes. For Catherine, who had known genteel poverty all her life, who had worn the cast-offs of richer relations, this sudden plunge into limitless luxury must have been intoxicating beyond all imagining, and she revelled in it, delighting in her gorgeous gowns and her glittering jewels with the unaffected joy of a girl given the run of a treasure house. There is something genuinely touching in her delight, in the simple pleasure she took in beautiful things. The poor relation transformed into a bejewelled queen, drinking in the splendour she had never known with an artless and innocent joy. She loved to dance too, and the court entertainments gave her endless opportunity to indulge that love, the music and the dancing that were among the chief pleasures of court life. Catherine was young and lively, and fond of gaiety, and she threw herself into the dancing with evident delight, the pretty young queen moving gracefully through the figures of the dance, the centre of all eyes glittering in her finery, radiant with youth and pleasure. The court watched her with varying feelings, some charmed by her youthful gaiety, some contemptuous of her frivolity, some merely watchful, calculating, waiting. But she herself seems to have been, in those bright months, simply and innocently happy, a girl enjoying the pleasures that her sudden elevation had brought her, the dancing and the finery and the music and the gaiety, all unaware that she was watched by enemies, all unaware of the precipice she danced upon. It is the image of her that is perhaps the kindest to carry, the queen dancing, happy and radiant and innocent, in the brief bright days before the darkness came. And she was kind too in those days, generous and warm-hearted in the careless way of the young, fond of giving gifts and showing favour, remembering those who had been good to her, trying in her way to do well by the people around her. She used her position to help members of her family and her old connections, to show kindness to those who appealed to her, to be generous with the wealth and favour that were now hers to dispense. There was no malice in her, no cruelty, none of the calculation or the spite that flourished so readily at that court. She was simply a warm-hearted, pleasure-loving creature, suddenly given vast wealth and position, and inclined to enjoy it and to share it, to be kind where she could, and to take pleasure where she found it. It is worth holding on to this picture of her, the kind and generous and happy queen of those brief bright months, because it is the truest picture of who she really was, beneath all the tragedy that came before and after, a sweet-natured girl who loved beautiful things and pleasure and gaiety, and who wished no one any harm, and who deserved so much better than the fate that the world had in store for her. And we must look with the gentleness it requires at the reality of her marriage, at what it actually meant for a girl that age to be the wife of this particular man. For the king she had married was not a young husband, but an old and ailing one, heavy and sick and decades her senior, his body ruined, his leg ulcerating, his temper uncertain. Whatever the gorgeous trappings of her new life, the central fact of it was that she was bound in marriage to a man old enough to be her grandfather, a man whose physical person can have held little appeal for one her age, however she may have valued the crown and the jewels and the position. The king doted on her, called her his rose, lavished gifts upon her, and for a time he seemed almost rejuvenated by his wife, happier and more content than he had been in years. But for beneath the splendor, the marriage cannot have been anything but a strange and difficult thing, a girl tied to an aging invalid, performing the duties of a wife to a man she could not possibly have desired, her youth bound to his decay. We need not say more than that, for the rest belongs to her, and is not ours to dwell upon. It is enough to understand the fundamental loneliness of her position, the queen in her gilded splendor, married to a sick old man, surrounded by a court that watched her every move, with no one in all the world whose true and selfless care it was to love and protect her. Into that loneliness, before very long, came the temptation that would destroy her. The temptation had a name, and the name was Thomas Culpeper. He was a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, a courtier close to the king, handsome and charming and near to Catherine in age, all that her aging husband was not. He moved in the inner circle of the court, was often in the king's company, and therefore often near the queen, and between the queen and the courtier there grew in the months of her marriage a dangerous attraction. We should be careful and fair in how we understand this, for it is the act for which Catherine has been most condemned, and it deserves to be seen clearly rather than through the lens of the old harsh judgment. Here was a girl of 17 or 18, married against any natural inclination to a sick man of nearly 50, surrounded by the gaiety and the temptation of a youthful court, and drawn, as the young so easily are, toward a handsome courtier of her own age who paid her ardent attention. It was reckless beyond words, given who her husband was and what he had done to wives who displeased him. It was a fatal folly. But it was also the entirely human folly of a lonely girl, reaching for the warmth and the youth and the affection that her marriage could never give her, and if we cannot quite excuse it, given the deadly stakes, we can surely understand it, and pity the creature who stumbled into it with no real sense of the abyss that yawned beneath her feet. For she seems genuinely not to have grasped the danger, and that failure to grasp it is itself a measure of how poorly she had been prepared for the world she lived in. A wiser, better guided, more worldly young woman might have understood that for the wife of Henry VIII, a man who had beheaded one queen already on charges of adultery, even the appearance of impropriety with another man was to flirt with death itself. But she was none of those things. She was undereducated and unworldly, raised in a careless household where exactly such unguarded attachments had been allowed to flourish, and she seems to have carried that same careless unawareness into the infinitely more dangerous setting of the court, behaving as though she was still a girl in the maiden's chamber, rather than the wife of a murderous king. She allowed the dangerous intimacy with Culpeper to develop, allowed clandestine encounters to be arranged, and conducted herself with a recklessness that, to anyone who understood the court, was simply suicidal. She was playing with fire, and did not even seem to know that it could burn. That terrible innocence, that fatal failure to understand her own peril, is one of the most poignant things about her whole sad story. And here a third figure enters the tragedy, one whose involvement carries a dark and dreadful irony. For the woman who helped to arrange and conceal the clandestine meetings between the Queen and Thomas Culpeper was Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, and Jane Boleyn had been at the very heart of an earlier royal catastrophe. She was the widow of George Boleyn, brother of Anne Boleyn, and she had been deeply entangled in the downfall of Anne and George 5 years before, had given evidence that sent them both to the scaffold on charges of adultery and incest. Now, here she was again, a lady of the Queen's household, and this time she did not help to destroy a queen through testimony, but helped instead to ruin one through facilitation, acting as the go-between who arranged the clandestine encounters between Catherine and Culpeper, keeping watch, carrying messages, enabling the dangerous liaison that would destroy them all. Why she did it has never been entirely clear, whether from some twisted loyalty, or a desire to ingratiate herself, or simply a failure to grasp, as Catherine failed to grasp, the deadly danger of the game. But do it she did, and in doing so she led the foolish queen step by step toward the same scaffold that had claimed the Boleyns, the same block, the same end. The shadow of Anne Boleyn lay over the whole of Catherine's story, the Howard cousin who had gone before her to the throne and then to the axe, and now even the same grim attendant was present at the second tragedy as at the first, weaving once more the threads of a queen's destruction. The figure of Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, who helped to arrange the meetings that destroyed Catherine, deserves a fuller telling, for her story is one of the strangest and darkest in the whole sorry tale. A woman twice entangled in the destruction of a queen, and her own end as terrible as the one she helped to bring about. She had been born Jane Parker, of a good family, and had married George Boleyn, the brother of Anne Boleyn, becoming part of the Boleyn family at the height of their power, when Anne was queen and the Boleyns stood at the summit of the court. But the marriage, by most accounts, was not a happy one, and when the catastrophe came, when Anne Boleyn fell and was accused of adultery and treason, Jane Boleyn played a dark and disputed role in the destruction of her own husband and his sister. For it was alleged, and it has been believed ever since, though the truth is uncertain, that Jane gave evidence against George and Anne, that she contributed to the monstrous charge of incest between brother and sister that was among the accusations that sent them both to the scaffold. Whether she did so willingly or under pressure, or whether the story is even true, has never been settled, but the shadow of it clung to her, the woman who had helped to destroy her own husband and his sister. So Jane Boleyn came to Catherine's household already marked by one royal tragedy, already a figure associated with the destruction of a queen, and there is something deeply unsettling in her reappearance at the centre of a second. After George Boleyn's execution, she had continued at court, a widow of the Boleyn connection, serving in the households of the successive queens, a survivor of the catastrophe that had destroyed her husband's family. And now she found herself in the household of Catherine Howard, cousin of the very Anne Boleyn, in whose fall she had been implicated. And this time she played not the role of accuser, but the role of facilitator, the go-between who arranged and concealed the secret meetings between the Queen and Thomas Culpeper. Why she did it remains one of the mysteries of the story. She may have sought to make herself useful and indispensable to her mistress, to secure her own position through Catherine's gratitude. She may have taken some strange satisfaction in the intrigue, some vicarious pleasure in the romance she enabled. Or she simply lacked the judgment to see the catastrophe she was helping to create. Whatever her motive, she made herself the essential instrument of the Queen's recklessness. The watcher at the door, the carrier of messages, the arranger of the meetings that would destroy them all. There is a dreadful irony, almost too neat to be borne, in the fact that the same woman was present at the destruction of both Howard queens, that Jane Boleyn helped to bring down Anne Boleyn and then, years later, helped to bring down Catherine Howard, the two cousins linked not only by blood and by their fates, but by this single sinister figure who hovered at the edge of both their tragedies. It is as though she were some dark attendant spirit of the Howard Queen's destruction, present at the fall of the first and the fall of the second, weaving the threads of ruin around both of them, and in the end her involvement with Catherine brought upon her the very fate she had helped to inflict on others, for when the investigation uncovered the secret meetings, Jane Boleyn was arrested along with Catherine, implicated as the facilitator of the treasonous liaison, and condemned to die for her part in it. The woman who had given evidence against one queen and arranged the ruin of another was herself to die for it at last. Jane Boleyn's end was as strange as her life, for it is said that during her imprisonment in the Tower she lost her reason, descended into a sort of madness, perhaps from terror, perhaps from the weight of all she had done and all that was now closing in upon her. So alarming was her mental state that there was a legal difficulty in executing her, for the law did not permit the execution of the insane, and a special measure had to be passed to allow her to be executed despite her madness. And so, on the same February morning that Catherine Howard died, Jane Boleyn was executed immediately after the Queen, on the same scaffold within the Tower, the second of the two women to die that day. She had brought down Anne Boleyn, had brought down Catherine Howard, and now she died on the same ground where both of them had died or would die. Her own life ended by the same machinery she had twice set in motion against others. There is a grim justice in it, perhaps the facilitator of two queens' destruction meeting her own end on the same scaffold. But there is horror in it too, the woman dragged to her death in madness, a final dreadful victim of the same merciless machinery that had consumed so many, including, twice over, the queens she had helped to bring down. The secret meetings themselves, conducted in the various palaces as the court moved about the countryside on its summer progress, were the height of recklessness, and the danger of them can scarcely be overstated. To arrange such encounters between the Queen and a courtier, to slip about the palaces by backstairs and secret doors, to conceal it from the swarming, watchful eyes of a court where nothing stayed hidden for long, was to court catastrophe with each passing day, and it could not, of course, stay hidden. Nothing stayed hidden at that court, where every servant might be a spy, and every faction watched its rivals for any weapon to use against them, and the Queen of England slipping off to clandestine meetings with a handsome young man was about the most dangerous secret that could possibly exist. Sooner or later it would come out, and when it did, the consequences would be beyond anything the foolish girl could imagine. She went on through the months of 1541, dancing on the edge of the precipice, meeting her courtier in stealth, all unaware that the ground was already crumbling beneath her, that the threads of her destruction were already being drawn together, that the years she had left behind in the negligent household of her childhood was about to rise up and meet the recklessness of her marriage, and that the two together would destroy her utterly. The secret meetings with Thomas Culpeper, the recklessness that would destroy her, unfolded largely during a long journey, the royal progress to the north in the summer of 1541, and it is worth dwelling on that progress, for it was the strange travelling stage upon which the final act of Catherine's tragedy was played out. A royal progress was a grand expedition in which the king and his entire court travelled through the kingdom, moving from place to place, staying at the noble houses and castles along the route, displaying the majesty of the crown to the people, and receiving the homage of the regions. The progress of 1541 was a particularly grand and important one. A long journey to the north of England, to the regions that had risen in rebellion a few years before, undertaken to overawe the northern subjects and demonstrate the king's power and to receive their renewed submission. The whole court travelled, an enormous moving company of more than 1,000 people, with all their baggage and horses and provisions, winding slowly through the summer countryside, and Catherine, the queen, travelled at the king's side, the centrepiece of the royal display. Imagine the strange conditions of life on such a progress, the constant movement, the nightly arrival at new and unfamiliar lodgings, the disruption of the ordinary routines and supervisions of court life. Each night the vast travelling court would settle into some new house or castle, hastily arranging itself in unfamiliar quarters, the king and queen and their attendants lodged in whatever rooms the place afforded. And in this constant disruption, this nightly improvisation of lodgings, the ordinary watchfulness of the court was loosened, the usual structures of supervision disturbed, opportunities created in the confusion of travel that would not have existed in the settled routine of a royal palace. It was in these unsettled conditions, moving from house to house through the northern summer, that she and Culpeper conducted their secret meetings, slipping away in the night, finding the private moments that the disruption of the progress made possible, with Lady Rochford keeping watch and arranging the encounters. The very journey that was meant to display the majesty and security of the crown became the cover for the Queen's fatal recklessness. There is something almost unbearably poignant in the picture of Catherine on that progress, the Queen at the height of her glory, riding through the cheering crowds at the King's side, magnificent in her finery, the centre of all eyes, and all the while sowing, in secret, the seeds of her own destruction. She was 18 now, and she had everything that the world could offer: the crown, the wealth, the position, the doting devotion of the king, and she was throwing it all away, night by night, in the reckless pursuit of a young man's affection, with no apparent understanding of the abyss that yawned beneath her. She danced on the edge of the precipice through that whole long summer journey, gay and glittering by day, conducting her deadly secret by night, and the contrast between the public magnificence and the private peril is one of the most haunting things in her story. She was never closer to the summit of her fortune than on that progress, and never closer, though she did not know it, to the catastrophe that would destroy her, the two things proceeding together, the glory and the doom, through the long bright days of that northern summer. And the progress carries one further poignancy, for it was during this very journey, by some accounts, that the king was at his happiest with his wife, most devoted, most content, most convinced that in Catherine he had found the late renewal of joy that crowned his aging life. He showered her with attention and gifts, displayed her proudly to his northern subjects, seemed rejuvenated by her youth and her gaiety, an old man briefly happy in the glow of his wife's company. He even, upon the court's return from the progress, ordered special prayers of thanksgiving to be offered for the good life he led, and trusted to lead with his beloved queen, a public expression of his contentment and his gratitude for the happiness she had brought him. And it was almost in the very moment of that thanksgiving, within days of those prayers, that the blow fell, that the letter reached Cranmer, and the investigation began, and the whole edifice of the king's happiness came crashing down. The progress was the high summer of Catherine's fortune, the king's contentment at its peak, the queen at the zenith of her glory, and it was followed at once by the swift and terrible autumn of her fall. The happiness and the catastrophe pressed up against each other, the one collapsing directly into the other, as though the height of her fortune had been only the necessary prelude to the depth of her ruin. There is an illuminating comparison to be drawn, as Catherine's tragedy unfolds, with the woman she had replaced, Anne of Cleves, for the contrast between the fates of the fourth wife and the fifth, tells us something profound about survival and destruction at the court of Henry VIII. Anne of Cleves, the German princess, had been married to the king and then set aside, her marriage annulled after only 6 months when the king found he could not bear her. By every conventional measure, Anne's queenship had been a failure, a humiliation, a rejection. And yet Anne had emerged from that apparent catastrophe not destroyed but triumphant, rewarded with wealth and honour and a long, safe, comfortable life, because she had been wise enough to accept her dismissal gracefully, to give the king exactly what he wanted, to bend before his will rather than break against it. Anne had read her dangerous situation with perfect clarity and had chosen survival over pride, and she had won her life and her freedom by that choice. She would outlive Henry and all his other wives, dying old and rich and content in her bed, the great survivor of the six. Now, set against Anne's wise survival, the fate of the girl who replaced her, and the contrast could not be sharper or more instructive. Where Anne had been shrewd, worldly, and self-possessed, a grown woman who understood her danger and navigated it with cool intelligence, Catherine was young, unworldly, and reckless, a girl who understood nothing of her peril and stumbled blindly toward catastrophe. Where Anne had given Henry exactly what he wanted and been rewarded for it, she gave Henry the one thing he could never forgive, the appearance of betrayal, and was destroyed for it. Where Anne had bent before the king's will and survived, Catherine, through no real fault of her own but through the recklessness born of her neglected upbringing, did the one thing that the wife of Henry VIII could never do and live, and paid the ultimate price. The two women, the fourth wife and the fifth, present an almost perfect study in contrasts, the survivor and the victim, the wise and the unguided, the one who read her situation and lived, and the one who could not read it and died. And yet we must be careful and fair in drawing this contrast, for it would be cruel and false to blame Catherine for lacking what Anne possessed, as though her destruction was simply the result of her own foolishness compared to Anne's wisdom. For consider the difference in their circumstances and their preparation. Anne of Cleves was a grown woman, brought up in the careful, ordered, if confined household of a German ducal court, given the steady upbringing of a princess, but possessed of a natural shrewdness and self-command. Catherine was a girl of perhaps 16, reared in sheer neglect, undereducated, unprotected, with none of the worldliness or the steady character that Anne brought to her ordeal. It is no fairer to blame Catherine for lacking Anne's wisdom than it would be to blame a child for lacking an adult's judgment, for that, in effect, is what the comparison amounts to. The contrast between a self-possessed grown woman and a poorly raised girl. The qualities that saved Anne were the products of an upbringing and a maturity that Catherine had never been given the chance to develop. Anne survived because she had been equipped to survive. She perished because she had been equipped for nothing at all, least of all for the deadly position her family thrust her into. The comparison, then, is not finally a comparison of two women's characters, the wise and the foolish, but a demonstration of how much depended on preparation and circumstance, on whether a woman had been given the tools to navigate the deadly world she found herself in. Anne had those tools and used them brilliantly. She had none through no fault of her own, and was destroyed for the lack of them. And there is a further poignancy in the fact that the two women knew each other, that she had served as a maid of honour in Anne's household before supplanting her, and that after Catherine's fall, Anne lived quietly on the survivor, while the girl who had replaced her went to the scaffold. Anne of Cleves outlived Catherine Howard by 15 years, dying peacefully in her bed long after the girl who had taken her crown had been beheaded and forgotten. The wise survivor and the unguided victim, the one who lived and the one who died, their fates set side by side in the strange procession of Henry's wives, a lesson in how the same dangerous king could be survived by wisdom, and how, without it, he destroyed the helpless who came within his reach. The blow, when it came first not from the present, but from the past, from the buried years of Catherine's neglected childhood that she must have hoped were forgotten. For when Catherine rose so suddenly to become queen, the people who had known her in the old days, in the careless household of the Duchess, saw an opportunity, and they came to court seeking favour and position from their former companion who had risen so high. Among them, fatally, was Francis Dereham, the young man with whom Catherine had been entangled in her girlhood, who now appeared at court, and, whether through Catherine's misguided kindness or her fear of what he knew, was given a position in her household. It was a catastrophic mistake, though it is hard to see what else the trapped young queen could have done, for to refuse him might have been as dangerous as to admit him, given the secrets he carried. But to bring Dereham into her household was to bring the buried past into the very heart of her present, to place within arm's reach the living evidence of those early unprotected years, and it meant that the two halves of her vulnerability, the exploited childhood and the reckless marriage, were now gathered together in one place, waiting only for a spark to bring the whole edifice down. The spark came in the autumn of 1541. The king and queen had been away on a long progress through the north of the kingdom, and during this time, those who wished the family ill, the rival faction at court, the reformers who hated the conservative Catholic faction and resented their renewed power through her, had been quietly gathering information. The old stories of Catherine's life in the Duchess's household, the business with Manox, and the more serious matter of Dereham had begun to circulate among people who had known her then, and they made their way in time to the ears of those who would use them. The man who received the fatal information was Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the leading reformer and no friend to the family, and when he learned of the Queen's past, he found himself holding a weapon of terrible power. He moved carefully, for the charge was an appalling one to bring against the king's beloved wife, and he chose not to confront the king directly, but to leave a written account, a letter, for Henry to find and read in private, setting out what had been alleged about the Queen's conduct before her marriage. The man whose hand set Catherine's destruction in motion deserves a closer look, for Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was a central figure in the religious revolution of the age, and his role in the Queen's fall was bound up with the factional struggle that shaped everything at that court. Cranmer was the leading reformer in England, the architect under the king of much of the religious change that was transforming the country, the thoughtful and cautious and deeply committed man who had risen to the highest office in the English Church, and who steered the kingdom, as far as the king would allow, toward the new Protestant ideas. He was by temperament a mild and scholarly man rather than a ruthless schemer, but he was also a leader of the Reform Party, and the Reform Party was locked in deadly struggle with the conservative Catholic faction led by the Howards, and Catherine's elevation had been a triumph for the Conservatives and a setback for the Reformers. In the cold logic of that factional war, the destruction of the Howard Queen would be a blow against the whole Howard interest, and so when the information about Catherine's past came into Reformer hands, it was a weapon of immense value, and Cranmer was the man who wielded it. We should be careful and fair about Cranmer's motives, for the matter is not simple. It is possible that he acted, at least in part, from genuine conviction, from a real belief that the king had a right to know the truth about his wife, that concealing such a matter would be wrong. But it is also undeniable that the destruction of Catherine served the Reformer cause, that it struck a heavy blow against the conservative Howards, and that Cranmer, whatever his personal scruples, was a leader of the faction that stood to gain enormously from the Queen's fall. The truth, as so often at that court, was probably a tangle of motives, conviction and calculation intertwined, The genuine belief that the king should know the truth, mixed with the keen awareness that the truth would advance the reformer cause and ruin their rivals. What is certain is that the information, once it reached Cranmer, became a factional weapon as much as a moral concern, and that the Queen's personal tragedy was also, and inseparably, a move in the political game that swirled endlessly around the king. The manner in which Cranmer delivered the fatal information shows both his caution and the genuine danger of the situation, for to bring such a charge against the king's beloved wife was perilous in the extreme. Had the king refused to believe it, had he chosen to defend his queen and turn his wrath on her accusers, Cranmer himself might have been destroyed for daring to slander her, and so the archbishop proceeded with utmost care, choosing not to confront the king directly with the accusation, not to speak the dreadful words aloud, but to set them down in writing, in a letter, which he arranged to have placed where the king would find and read it in private, during a service in the chapel. It was a careful and a cowardly and a clever way to deliver a mortal blow, allowing Cranmer to convey the devastating information without having to face the king's first reaction, letting the written word do the work, while the messenger stood at a safe distance. The king found the letter and read it, and the contents of that single document set in motion everything that followed: the investigation, the confessions, the arrests, the executions, the whole machinery of destruction that would grind the Queen to death. A piece of paper, slipped into the king's hand in a chapel, was the instrument of Catherine's doom. And here we should pause on the cruel irony that the religious and factional struggles of the age, which Catherine neither understood nor cared about, were instrumental in her destruction, that she was in part a casualty of a war she did not even know she was fighting. Catherine was no partisan of the old faith or the new. She was a girl interested in dancing and finery and pleasure, with no apparent religious conviction or political awareness at all. But she had been made queen by the conservative Howards, and that made her, willy-nilly, a piece on the factional board, a symbol of conservative ascendancy, a target for the reformers who wished to bring the Howards down. Her personal recklessness with Culpeper gave her enemies the weapon they needed, but the eagerness with which that weapon was seized and wielded owed much to the factional struggle, to the reformers' desire to strike at the Howard interest through the Howard Queen. Catherine was destroyed for her own folly, yes, but she was also destroyed because she stood, all unknowing, at the centre of a political war, a girl caught in the crossfire of a factional struggle she did not understand, her personal tragedy serving the cold purposes of men who cared nothing for her and everything for the advantage her fall would bring them. Imagine the king receiving that letter in the first days of November 1541, in the midst of his contentment with his rose without a thorn. Henry, by every account, at first refused to believe it. So great was his infatuation with his wife, so unwilling was he to accept that his late renewal of joy was built on a lie. He ordered the matter investigated, expecting, it seems, that the slander would be disproved and his happiness restored. But the investigation, once begun, did not disprove the allegations. It confirmed them, and then it uncovered far worse. For when the king's men began to dig into Catherine's girlhood, questioning those who had attended her in the Duchess's household, the old stories of Manox and Dereham were confirmed, and the Queen's situation grew at once perilous. And then, as the investigation widened, and the frightened members of her household were questioned and pressed, something far more dangerous than the buried years began to emerge: the hidden truth of the present, the clandestine meetings with Thomas Culpeper during the very months of her marriage, the recklessness that was not old history, but current and ongoing betrayal of the king himself. Once that thread was pulled, the whole tragedy unravelled with terrible speed. The investigators, sensing the magnitude of what they had stumbled upon, pressed harder and under questioning and the threat of worse, the secrets came tumbling out. Derham questioned about her girlhood, revealed in his desperation the present danger by naming Culpeper, perhaps hoping to shift attention from himself, perhaps simply breaking under pressure. Lady Rochford questioned about the secret meetings, gave way and told what she knew, confirming the clandestine encounters she had helped to arrange. The frightened members of the household, terrified for their own lives, confessed what they had seen and known, and piece by piece the investigators assembled the full and damning picture, the Queen's unprotected past with Manox and Dereham, and far more deadly, her reckless encounters with Culpeper while married to the King. It was a catastrophe of the first order, and there was no escaping it now. The young Queen, who only weeks before had been dancing in her gorgeous gowns, the King's beloved Rose, was suddenly revealed as a woman with a hidden history, and far worse, a present secret that touched the King's own honour, and the machinery of the Tudor state, which ground its victims so fine, began to turn against her. The investigation that destroyed Catherine, once it was set in motion by Cranmer's letter, unfolded with a terrible and methodical thoroughness, and it is worth following its course, for it shows the merciless efficiency of the Tudor state when it turned its machinery against a victim. The King, having read the accusation, at first refused to believe it, so deep was his attachment to his wife, and he ordered the matter investigated in the expectation that the slander would be disproved. But the investigation, once begun, took on a momentum of its own, and it was conducted by men who understood that rich rewards awaited those who uncovered the truth and grave dangers, those who failed to pursue it diligently. They began with the allegations about Catherine's girlhood, questioning those who had known her in the Duchess's household, and they quickly found confirmation of the old stories, for there were many who had been present in those careless years, and who, under questioning, confirmed what had been alleged. The matter of the past was established with damning speed, and the Queen's situation grew at once grave. But it was the widening of the investigation, the pursuit of the matter beyond her girlhood and into the present, that turned a grave situation into a fatal one. As the King's men questioned the members of Catherine's household, pressing them, frightening them, threatening them with the dreadful consequences of concealing anything, the frightened servants and attendants began to give way, and one revelation led to another. The matter of the past led to questions about the present, and the questions about her marriage led, with terrible inevitability, to the encounters with Culpeper. Once the investigators caught the scent of a present betrayal touching the King's own honour, they pursued it relentlessly, and the frightened members of the household, terrified for their own lives, told what they knew. The confessions came tumbling out, each one drawn from a frightened person desperate to save themselves by full cooperation, each one adding another piece to the damning picture, each one tightening the net around the doomed young Queen. The machinery of investigation, once it had its teeth into the matter, did not stop until it had wrung out each secret, exposed each meeting, named each name. There is something genuinely horrifying in the picture of that investigation, in the spectacle of the frightened household turning on itself, each person betraying what they knew in the desperate hope of saving their own skin. The attendants who had served Catherine, who had perhaps liked her, who had been part of her household and her daily life, now confessed everything they had seen and known, the encounters, the messages, the comings and goings, sparing no detail that might demonstrate their own cooperation and innocence. Lady Rochford, who had arranged the meetings, broke under the pressure and told what she knew. The men, Dereham and Culpeper, were arrested and interrogated, and under questioning, under the threat or perhaps the reality of torture, gave way and confessed. Piece by piece, confession by confession, the full and damning truth was assembled, the past and the present both, the exploited childhood and the reckless marriage. all of it laid bare by the relentless questioning, all of it gathered into the case that would end the Queen's life. The girl who had been so carelessly unguarded all her life was now the object of the most thorough and merciless attention imaginable, each secret of her short existence dragged into the light to be used against her. And through all of this, Catherine herself was questioned, frightened and alone, pressed to confess, and her responses in those terrible interrogations are among the most poignant evidence we have of her character and her plight. She seems to have been overwhelmed by terror, by turns confessing and denying, weeping and pleading, a girl utterly out of her depth, facing the full crushing weight of the Tudor state with no defender and no advocate, and no real understanding of how to save herself. She admitted the matters of her past, the relationships before her marriage, but she desperately denied the most dangerous charge, the actual adultery with Culpeper during her marriage, insisting on her innocence of that final and fatal accusation, even as the evidence mounted against her. Whether she was guilty of that last charge, in fact, or only of the reckless appearance of it, has never been certain, and perhaps it hardly mattered, for the appearance alone was enough to destroy her. What is certain is the picture of the terrified girl in those interrogations alone before her accusers, pleading and weeping and denying, with no one in all the world to stand beside her or speak for her, facing her destruction with nothing but her own frightened and inadequate resources. It is a picture to break the heart, the unguarded child finally receiving the full attention of the powerful, and that attention being entirely bent upon her destruction. The king's reaction, when the full truth was laid before him, was a terrible thing to behold, and it tells us something of what she had meant to him, and how deeply her fall wounded him. Henry, who had refused at first to believe a word against his young wife, was forced at last to accept the evidence, and when he did, his grief was said to be genuine and overwhelming. This was not the cold calculation with which he had destroyed Anne Boleyn, when his love had already curdled into hatred and he wished only to be rid of her. With Catherine, the king seems to have been truly heartbroken, for he had loved her, or loved what she represented. The late renewal of his youth, the sweet young joy that had brightened his aging and ailing decline. To discover that his Rose had a past she had hidden from him, and worse, that she had betrayed him during their marriage with a young man of his own court, shattered something in the old king. He is said to have wept before his council, to have called for a sword to kill her himself, to have raged and grieved by turns, an old man whose last dream of happiness had collapsed into humiliation and betrayal. And when a king of Henry's nature was wounded so deeply, his grief did not stay grief for long. It turned, as it always turned, to rage, and the rage turned to a determination for revenge, and the revenge would be paid in blood. Let us return, for a fuller telling, to the terrible days when the storm broke over Catherine, to the scenes of her arrest and her confinement, for these are among the most haunting passages of her whole story, and they deserve to be felt in their full weight. The blow fell at Hampton Court, the palace on the river where the court was lodged in the early days of November 1541, in the aftermath of the triumphant northern progress. Catherine was still, in those first days, ignorant of what was gathering against her, still the happy young queen, while around her the king and his council, having received Cranmer's letter, were already setting in motion the investigation that would destroy her. She was confined to her apartments, the first sign that something was terribly wrong, kept from the king, kept from the freedom of the court, while the questioning proceeded and the evidence mounted. And it was there, in those apartments at Hampton Court, that the most famous and most haunting scene of her whole tragedy is said to have taken place, the scene that has given the palace its enduring legend. For it is said that Catherine, realizing that she was to be taken, that her doom was closing upon her, and seized by a desperate hope that she might yet save herself, if only she could reach the king and plead with him face to face, broke away from those who guarded her and ran. She ran from her apartments along the length of the long gallery toward the chapel where the king was hearing mass, desperate to reach him, to throw herself upon his mercy, certain in her terror that she could move him if only she could come before him and speak. But she was caught before she reached the chapel door, seized by the guards and dragged back along the gallery, screaming, her cries for the king echoing through the palace, while Henry sat at his devotions and did not stir, did not come out to her, did not so much as turn his head toward the sound of his young wife screaming his name. Whether the scene happened exactly so, in every detail, we cannot be certain, for such stories grow and change in the telling. But it has become part of the very fabric of the palace, the legend that the gallery is haunted still by the screaming of the doomed young queen. And whether or not it is literally true, it captures with terrible vividness the truth of her situation, the trapped girl, the desperate hope, the cold finality of the king who had already closed his heart against her. From Hampton Court she was taken, in time, to Sion, a former abbey on the river that had been dissolved in the destruction of the monasteries, and now served as a residence to hold the fallen queen. There she was confined through the winter weeks while her fate was decided, held in a kind of grim and dignified imprisonment, stripped of the title of queen, deprived of her jewels and her finest clothes and her freedom, but still attended by a small household, still treated with a residue of the ceremony due to her former rank. Imagine those weeks at Sion, the woman who had been the glittering Queen of England now a prisoner in a dissolved abbey, waiting through the short dark weeks of winter, for the death she must have known was coming. She was kept in seclusion, away from the court and the world, her household reduced, her splendor stripped away, alone with her terror and her dwindling hope. The contrast with the bright days of her queenship, with the dancing and the finery and the gaiety of only weeks before, could not have been more cruel. The queen fallen in the space of days from the summit of her glory to the cold seclusion of her prison, waiting for the end. And it was from Sion, at last, that she was taken to the Tower, when her fate had been sealed by the act of attainder removed by barge down the cold river to the fortress where she would die. Picture that final journey. The woman carried down the Thames in the depth of winter, past the city, to the grim fortress of the Tower, knowing now that there was no hope left, that she was going to her death. The barge would have passed beneath the walls, through the water gate, into the heart of the fortress that had consumed so many, and Catherine would have been led to the royal lodgings where she would spend her last days, the same fortress that had held her cousin Anne Boleyn before her death, 6 years before. The journey from Sion to the Tower was the closing passage of her short life, the last stage of the descent from queen to prisoner to condemned woman, and at the end of it lay only the scaffold and the block and the cold February morning when it would all be over. She had travelled in the space of 1.5 years from the obscurity of a poor relation to the summit of the kingdom, and now to the threshold of a violent death, and the whole dizzying arc of it, the rise and the fall, was nearly complete, with only the final terrible scene still to come. She was taken from the palace and confined, first under guard, and then removed to Sion, while the machinery of the law was prepared against her, and while she waited there, frightened and alone, the men caught up in her ruin were dealt with first, for before the queen herself could be reached, those who had been entangled with her had to be tried and condemned. The 2 men who died for their entanglement with Catherine deserve their own moment of attention, for Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham were themselves caught up in the tragedy, and their fates, and the difference between them, tell us something about the world that destroyed them all. Thomas Culpeper, the man with whom Catherine was accused of betraying the king during her marriage, was a young gentleman of the king's privy chamber, a courtier of good family, who stood high in the king's favour, handsome and charming and ambitious. He was one of the inner circle who attended the king most closely, trusted and favoured, with a bright future before him, and it was this very closeness to the king, this position in the royal household, that brought him into proximity with the Queen and into the fatal attraction that destroyed them both. There is a dark irony in the fact that Culpeper, before his involvement with Catherine, was reportedly a man of some violence and bad character, accused of grave crimes in his earlier life that the king had pardoned, a favourite whose misdeeds had been overlooked because of his place in the royal affection. That such a man should have been the object of Catherine's reckless love adds another shade of tragedy to the picture, the Queen risking everything for a courtier who may have been far from worthy of it. Francis Derham, the other man who died, was a different figure, connected to Catherine's girlhood rather than her present, the companion of her girlhood in the Duchess's household, who had reappeared at court after her elevation. When Catherine became queen, Derham came seeking favour and position from his former companion, and was given a place in her household, a decision that proved fatal, for it brought the living evidence of her unprotected girlhood into the very heart of her present. Derham seems to have presumed upon his old connection with the Queen, to have behaved with a familiarity and an arrogance that drew attention and resentment, and when the investigation came, his earlier relationship with Catherine became one of the central matters of the case against her. Under interrogation, perhaps hoping to save himself by directing attention elsewhere, perhaps simply breaking under pressure, Derham revealed the name of Culpeper, pointing the investigators toward the far more dangerous matter of the moment, and so the two men, the lover of her girlhood and the lover of her present, were drawn together into the same net of destruction. The deaths of the two men reveal the brutal gradations of Tudor justice, the careful calibration of cruelty according to rank and circumstance. Both were condemned as traitors, for their involvement with the Queen was held to be treason against the king, a violation of his honour, and a threat to the security of the succession. But they did not die the same way, for the law distinguished cruelly between them. Culpeper, as a gentleman of good birth and high position, was granted the relative mercy of beheading, a swift and dignified death by the axe. Derthablots, desert standing and held in greater contempt, was granted no such mercy, but was condemned to the full horror of a traitor's execution, the dreadful prolonged end reserved for the worst offenders, an end of deliberate and extended cruelty. That the two men who had loved the same young queen should die so differently, the one swift and the other prolonged and terrible, according to the cold calculations of rank and favour, is a grim illustration of the world that Catherine lived and died in, a world in which even the manner of one's end was determined by one's rank, in which mercy and horror were dispensed according to birth, and in which the machinery of the state ground its victims fine according to careful and merciless rules. And we should spare a thought in the midst of Catherine's tragedy for the way these men too were caught and destroyed, for the tragedy was not Catherine's alone, but spread out to engulf all who came within its reach. Culpeper and Derham died, and Lady Rochford died, and others were imprisoned and ruined, and the whole circle of people around the Queen was scattered and broken by the catastrophe of her fall. This is how it worked at the court of Henry VIII, that the fall of a high figure pulled down everyone connected to them, that a queen's destruction was never a single ending but a whole web of ruin, spreading outward from the centre to consume all who had been close to her. Catherine's recklessness destroyed not only herself, but the men she had been involved with, and the woman who had helped her, a whole little world of people swept away in the catastrophe, their lives forfeit to their proximity to the doomed young queen. It is a measure of how dangerous it was to be close to the centre of power in that age, how the favour that raised people up could turn in an instant into the wrath that destroyed them, and how the fall of one could become the ruin of many. The means chosen to destroy Catherine was the same cold instrument that had been used against others who had displeased the king, an act of attainder, a law passed by Parliament, that simply declared a person guilty of treason and condemned them to death, without the inconvenience of a trial at which they might defend themselves. It was a brutal and efficient device, and it had the particular cruelty, in Catherine's case, of denying her any opportunity to speak in her own defence, to plead her youth or her circumstances or the wrongs that had been done to her, to be heard at all. The attainder was prepared, and passed in the early weeks of 1542, declaring the Queen guilty of a treasonous betrayal of the king and condemning her to death. There was a further refinement of cruelty in the law, for it was made treason for any woman whom the king proposed to marry to conceal her past unchastity from him, a law passed specifically to ensure that Catherine's hidden girlhood could be counted against her, so that even the wrongs done to her as an exploited child were turned into part of the case for killing her. The young queen, who had been failed and used at each stage of her short life, was now to be destroyed by a law written expressly to catch her, condemned without a hearing, her fate sealed by the very Parliament and Council that her family had once dominated. The place where Catherine spent her final days and met her death deserves its own moment of attention, for the Tower of London was no ordinary prison, and its long and terrible history gave a particular weight to the fate of those who ended their lives within its walls. It was many things at once: a fortress, a palace, a treasury, an armoury, and a prison, a sprawling complex of buildings and walls and towers that had stood guard over London for centuries, since the days of the Norman kings. It was a place of deep and ancient associations, woven into the whole history of the English crown, and among those associations, the darkest was its role as the prison and execution ground for the highest ones who fell from royal favour. For the fortress was where the kings of England held their most important prisoners, the nobles and royalty and fallen favourites who had offended the crown, and it was where many of them died, by execution or murder, or the slow ruin of long imprisonment. To be taken to the Tower was, for a great person, a thing of dread, for it so often meant that the end was near. The Tower's history was steeped in such tragedies, and Catherine, taken there in the last weeks of her life, was entering a fortress that had already consumed many victims of royal wrath. Within its walls, princes had been murdered, queens beheaded, nobles and bishops and ministers put to the block, a long procession of the powerful brought low, and ended in that grim fortress. And most painfully of all, for Catherine's story, the Tower was where her own cousin, Anne Boleyn, had been imprisoned and executed only 6 years before, on the very same charges of adultery and treason, brought to the same end on the same ground. When Catherine was taken there, she was following directly in the footsteps of Anne, entering the same fortress that had held her cousin, moving toward the same scaffold, the same block, the same end. The doubling of the two Howard queens, raised by the same family and destroyed by the same king, reached its grim completion in that fortress, where both of them spent their final days, and both of them died. The two cousins united at the last in the same dreadful place and the same dreadful fate. There is a particular detail of Catherine's imprisonment that captures the strange status of the fortress as both palace and prison, for she was not flung into a dungeon but held in lodgings, in the royal apartments of the fortress, treated, even in her condemnation, with a certain grim ceremony befitting her rank as queen, for it was a royal residence as well as a prison, and a fallen queen was still a queen until the axe ended her, lodged in chambers rather than cells, attended by servants, held in a captivity that preserved the outward forms of her dignity even as it prepared her end. There is something especially chilling in this, in the courteous imprisonment of the doomed queen, the careful preservation of ceremony around a woman who was being held only until she could be put to death. She passed her last days in those royal lodgings, frightened and alone, waiting for the end that the careful ceremony around her could not disguise or delay, the trappings of her queenship maintained to the very last, even as the substance of it, and her life with it, was being stripped away. And it was within those walls, on the patch of ground beside the chapel where the highest prisoners were executed away from the public gaze, that Catherine met her end, on that cold February morning, on the same spot where Anne Boleyn had died. The executions of the highest prisoners were carried out not in public before the crowds, but within the privacy of the fortress walls, a relative mercy that spared the condemned, the spectacle of a public end and the crown, the spectacle of executing its own queen before the people. And so Catherine died privately within the fortress, attended by the officials and the few witnesses that such an occasion required, on the green beside that church, in the heart of the ancient fortress that had consumed so many before her. Her body was buried within the fortress walls, in the church where the bodies of the executed were laid, and where her cousin Anne Boleyn already lay before her. In her last days, held now in the Tower of London, where so many of the king's victims had spent their final hours, she seems to have passed through terror to a kind of frightened composure. She was very young, and she was facing death, and the early accounts suggest she was at first overwhelmed by fear and grief, weeping and despairing, as well any girl might in such a circumstance. But as the end approached, she appears to have found some measure of courage, some quiet acceptance of the fate she could not escape. There is a famous story, which may or may not be true, but which has become part of her legend, that on the night before her execution, she asked for the block, the wooden block on which she would die, to be brought to her room, so that she might practice laying her head upon it, that she might do the terrible thing with grace and composure when the morning came. Whether it is true or not, the story captures something touching and dignified about her end, the frightened girl steeling herself to die well, to meet her death with the dignity that her short, chaotic life had so rarely allowed her, rehearsing in the darkness the last act she would ever perform. The morning came, the 13th of February 1542, cold and grey, and Catherine Howard was led out to die within the walls of the Tower, on the same patch of ground where her cousin Anne Boleyn had been beheaded not 6 years before. She was some 18 or 19 years old, a girl really, and she had been queen for scarcely more than a year and a half. By the accounts that survive, she was so weak with fear that she could hardly speak or stand and had to be helped to the scaffold, but she gathered herself at the last and made the short conventional speech that custom required, acknowledging her sentence, asking for mercy on her soul, commending herself to God. And then she knelt and laid her head upon the block she is said to have rehearsed upon, and the executioner did his work, and it was over. The short, sad life of the neglected girl from Chesworth ended on the scaffold at not yet 20. Lady Rochford, who had helped to arrange the meetings that destroyed her, was executed immediately after, on the same scaffold, the same morning. The two women who had walked into ruin together, leaving the world together. And so Catherine Howard passed out of life, the youngest of the king's wives, and the most pitiable, dead before she was 20, destroyed by the same machinery, and on the same ground as the cousin whose fate she had unknowingly been doomed to repeat. What became of the king after Catherine's death, and of the others caught up in her tragedy, is worth following, for the aftermath of her fall tells us much about the world that destroyed her, and about the man at the centre of it all. Henry VIII was, by every account, genuinely and deeply wounded by Catherine's betrayal in a way that he had not been by the loss of his earlier wives, and the discovery seems to have aged and broken him further. He had loved Catherine, or loved what she gave him, the illusion of recovered youth, the sweet young joy that had brightened his aging decline, and to lose her through betrayal and humiliation, struck him a blow from which he never fully recovered. The accounts of the time describe a king sunk in grief and self-pity, weeping before his council, raging at his fate, an old man whose last dream of happiness had collapsed into ashes. After her death he grew more morose, more suspicious, more difficult, his health declining, his temper worsening, the brief late renewal that Catherine had brought him replaced by a deepening of his final decay. The rose without a thorn had turned in his telling into a thing of poison, and the wound of it festered in him for the rest of his days. The Howard family, who had schemed to place Catherine on the throne, scrambled frantically to save themselves when she fell, and their conduct in the crisis is a study in cold self-preservation. The Duke of Norfolk, who had masterminded the whole enterprise, who had pushed his niece toward the king for the family's advancement, now moved swiftly to distance himself from her, to disavow any part in her crimes, to save his own skin by abandoning the girl he had used. He wrote grovelling letters to the king, expressing his horror at his niece's conduct, his loyalty to the crown, his innocence of any knowledge of her wickedness, for performing a frantic dance of self-exculpation, as the catastrophe he had helped to create threatened to engulf him. He had done the same when Anne Boleyn fell, had abandoned and condemned that niece too, and now he repeated the performance with Catherine, sacrificing the second niece as he had sacrificed the first, choosing his own survival over any loyalty to his blood. The old Dowager Duchess and various other members of the family were arrested and imprisoned for a time, suspected of having known of and concealed Catherine's past, and the family suffered a sharp if temporary eclipse, the price of the failed gamble. But Norfolk himself, the architect of it all, survived, slippery and ruthless to the last, living to scheme another day. And Henry married once more, for even after Catherine, even in his broken and ailing decline, Henry took a sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, a sensible and pious widow who became less a wife than a nurse to the dying king, tending him through his final years and surviving him by the narrowest of margins. With Catherine Parr, the dreadful procession of Henry's marriages came at last to an end, for the king did not long outlive his sixth wife's marriage, dying in the early days of 1547, some 5 years after Catherine Howard's execution, his vast ruined body finally giving way. He died as he had lived in his later years, a tyrant feared by all around him, his end almost a relief to a court that had trembled before him for so long. And with his passing, the long nightmare of his marriages was finally over, the 6 wives all accounted for, 2 divorced, 2 beheaded, 1 dead in childbed, and the last surviving to bury him. Catherine Howard was by then 5 years in her grave in the Tower Chapel, one of the 2 who had died upon the scaffold, the youngest and the most pitiable of all the women whose lives had been caught up and so often destroyed in the terrible business of being married to Henry VIII. It is worth reflecting, in the aftermath, on how little Catherine's death changed or accomplished, on the sheer waste of it, for her killing served no end beyond the satisfaction of the king's wounded pride and the advantage of the faction that engineered it. She had been no threat to the kingdom, no traitor in any meaningful sense, no danger to anyone but herself. She was a girl who had been reckless foolish in the way of the young, guilty at most of reaching for affection in a loveless marriage, and for this she was killed, her life snuffed out before she was 20, to soothe an old king's vanity, and serve the cold purposes of court factions. Nothing was gained by her death, that could not have been achieved by setting her aside, divorcing her, sending her away in disgrace as the king had sent away Anne of Cleves. But the king's wounded pride demanded blood, and the machinery of the state supplied it, and a girl died who need not have died, for no better reason than that powerful men found her death convenient or satisfying. It is the final cruelty of her story, the sheer pointlessness of her destruction, the waste of a young life sacrificed to nothing more than vanity and faction, a girl killed because it suited the powerful to kill her, and for no reason that could justify, or even adequately explain, so terrible an end. We have spoken several times of the shadow of Anne Boleyn that lies across Catherine's story, and it is worth pausing to draw out fully the strange and haunting parallel between the two Howard cousins, for the doubling of their fates is one of the most remarkable patterns in all of English history. Anne and Catherine were cousins, the daughters of a brother and sister of the Howard family, both granddaughters through their mothers or fathers, of the connections that bound the wide clan together. Anne was the elder by perhaps 15 or 20 years, a grown woman of sophistication and accomplishment, when Catherine was still a child, and the two can have had scarcely anything to do with each other in life, belonging to different generations of the sprawling family. But in their fates they were bound together with an almost supernatural closeness, the two Howard girls who became queens of England and who both ended their lives upon the scaffold, destroyed by the same king, on the same ground, for the same alleged crime. Consider the points of the parallel, for they are uncanny. Both women were raised up toward the throne by the ambition of the same family, the Howards, and the scheming of the same man, the Duke of Norfolk, who was uncle to them both. Both married the same king, Henry VIII, becoming his queen. Both were accused of adultery and treason, of betraying the king with other men. Both were condemned to death, Anne by trial and Catherine by act of attainder. Both were imprisoned in the Tower of London in their final days. Both were executed within the Tower walls, on the green beside the chapel, beheaded away from the public gaze. Both were buried in the same small church within the tower, the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. The parallel is so complete, so exact in its dreadful symmetry, that it seems almost too neat to be real, as though some grim playwright had designed the two tragedies to mirror each other. The two Howard queens following the same path from the same family's ambition, to the same king's bed, to the same scaffold and the same grave. And yet there were differences too, important ones, that distinguished the two tragedies and that bear on how we should understand Catherine. Anne Boleyn had been a player in her own story, a clever, ambitious, sophisticated woman who had actively pursued the crown, who had matched the king in wit and will, who had been a force in the politics and religion of her age. Whatever the truth of the charges against her, and they were almost certainly false, Anne had been an active agent in her own rise and a figure of real consequence, and her fall, however unjust, was the fall of a powerful woman brought down by the turning of the king's heart and the machinations of her enemies. Catherine was quite different, far more purely passive and more purely pitiable. She had not pursued the crown, but been pushed toward it. She had not been a force in politics or religion, but a girl interested only in pleasure and finery. She had not matched the king in anything but simply been used by him and by her family. Where Anne's tragedy was the fall of a great and active figure, Catherine's was the destruction of a helpless and passive child, and that difference makes Catherine's fate, in some ways, the more purely sorrowful of the two. The parallel between the cousins also tells us much that is damning about the family that produced and destroyed them both. For the Howards had watched Anne be raised to the throne and then beheaded, had seen with their own eyes how that game ended, and had then played it again with Catherine, knowing exactly the risk they were running. The Duke of Norfolk had presided over the trial that condemned Anne, had pronounced sentence of death upon his own niece, and then, a few years later, had schemed to place another niece in the same dangerous position, and had abandoned her too when she fell, scrambling to save himself by distancing himself from the girl he had used. There is a kind of monstrousness in the family's willingness to repeat the tragedy, to feed a second daughter into the same machine that had destroyed the first, learning nothing, caring nothing, pursuing power through the royal bed, even after that pursuit had cost one Howard girl her head. The shadow of Anne Boleyn lay across Catherine's whole story not merely as a haunting parallel, but as a warning that the family ignored, a lesson written in blood that the Howards refused to learn, and Catherine paid for their refusal with her life, the second Howard Queen to die on the scaffold, because her family valued power above the lives of its daughters. We should pause with the care that honesty requires on the question of what Catherine was actually guilty of, for it is a question that has never been fully settled, and the uncertainty around it matters greatly to how we judge her. The charges against her were essentially two. The first concerned her past, the relationships with Manox and Dereham before her marriage, and these were not in serious dispute, for there were many witnesses to them, and Catherine herself admitted, under questioning, the substance of what had happened in the Duchess's household. But, and this is crucial, these were matters from before her marriage, from her unprotected childhood and youth, and in any just reckoning they were not crimes at all, but wrongs done to her, the exploitation of a neglected girl by older men. That they were turned into part of the case against her, that her exploited girlhood was counted as evidence of her wickedness, is one of the monstrous injustices of her trial. The victim blamed for what had been done to her, the girl's suffering weaponized against the woman. The second charge, the truly fatal one, concerned the present, the alleged adultery with Thomas Culpeper during her marriage to the king, and here the truth is genuinely uncertain, that she met with Culpeper in stealth, repeatedly, with Lady Rochford's help, during the months of her marriage, seems beyond doubt, for it was confirmed by multiple witnesses and by the participants themselves. But what actually passed between Catherine and Culpeper at those meetings, whether they amounted to actual adultery or only to a dangerous and reckless intimacy that stopped short of the final act, has never been established with certainty. Catherine herself, under interrogation, admitted the meetings, but desperately denied that they had gone so far as adultery, insisting on her innocence of that ultimate charge, even as she confessed the recklessness of the encounters. Culpeper, too, denied that actual adultery had taken place, though both of them admitted to a guilty intimacy of intention and circumstance. The truth of what happened in those secret meetings died with them, and we cannot now know it, whether they were guilty indeed or only in the appearance and the intention that were, in that deadly context, quite enough to destroy them. But here is the point that matters most, and it is a point that the cruel old judgment of Catherine entirely misses. Whether or not she was guilty of actual adultery, in the strict legal sense, made little difference to her fate, and should make little difference to our compassion. For even if she never committed the final act, she had behaved with a recklessness that, for the wife of Henry VIII, was effectively suicidal, conducting clandestine encounters with a young man during her marriage to a king who had beheaded a wife for adultery already. The appearance was enough to destroy her, the reckless intimacy enough to seal her doom, regardless of whether the technical line had been crossed, and the recklessness itself, as we have seen, was the product of her whole tragic situation, the lonely girl in a loveless marriage reaching for warmth, raised in a careless household that had never taught her caution, thrust into a position she had no preparation for. Whether she was guilty in deed or only in folly, the deeper reality is the same, that a young and unguided girl, failed by all who should have protected her, stumbled into a fatal recklessness that the merciless world she lived in punished with death. And there is something to be said, too, about the impossibility of Catherine ever receiving real justice, for the machinery that destroyed her was not designed to discover the facts, but to confirm a predetermined doom. She was condemned by act of attainder, without a trial, without any opportunity to defend herself, to call witnesses, to challenge the evidence, to be heard at all. The confessions that damned her were extracted from frightened people desperate to save themselves, under conditions of pressure and terror that made their reliability deeply questionable. The whole proceeding was less an inquiry into the facts than a ritual of destruction, the assembling of a case to justify a death that had already been decided upon the moment the king's pride was wounded. In such a process, the actual question of Catherine's guilt or innocence was almost beside the point. She was going to die regardless, because the king willed it and the machinery served his will, and the careful question of what she had actually done was a refinement that the brutal reality of her situation rendered very nearly irrelevant. She was destroyed, not because her guilt was proven, but because her destruction was desired, and that, more than any question of adultery, is the reality at the heart of her fall. So what are we to make of her, this youngest and most tragic of the six, when we set aside the cruel old verdict and look at her with clear and gentle eyes? The legend gives us a foolish, wanton queen, vain and frivolous and unfaithful, who threw away her crown and her life through her own wickedness and folly, and got more or less what she deserved. But that legend is a cruelty heaped upon a girl who suffered enough cruelty in life, and it does not survive an honest look at her story. Consider what we actually find when we trace her short life from the beginning. We find a motherless daughter, born into genteel poverty, sent away to be raised in a careless household where no one truly watched over her. We find a vulnerable girl exploited by older men who took advantage of exactly that neglect, wronged when she was scarcely more than a child, and then, monstrously, blamed for it years later. We see a woman with no real education, no guidance, no protector, swept up by an ambitious family and used as an instrument of their advancement, pushed into the bed of an aging and dangerous king she had no power to refuse. We find a lonely girl married to a sick old man, reaching with fatal recklessness for the warmth and youth her marriage denied her, and we find her destroyed for all of it, condemned without a hearing, executed before she was 20, by the very people who had failed and used her at every turn. To understand Catherine's fate fully, we have to understand the position of women in her age, for she was caught not only by her family's ambition and the king's desire, but by the whole structure of a world that gave women, and especially the maids, almost no power over their own lives. In the England of the Tudors, a woman was, throughout her life, under the authority of men. As a child she was under the rule of her father, to be raised, married, or disposed of as he saw fit. As a wife she passed under the rule of her husband, who held near absolute control over her person and her property. A woman of the gentry or nobility had scant say in whom she married, for marriages were arranged by families for reasons of property and alliance, and a daughter who refused the match chosen for her faced the full weight of family displeasure, the loss of support and dowry and place. The idea that a woman might choose her own path, refuse a powerful suitor, or order her own life according to her own wishes, was very nearly unthinkable. Women were, in the eyes of that world and its law, perpetual dependents, passed from the authority of one man to another, their lives shaped by decisions made for them, rather than by them. Not. For a young woman of Catherine's particular situation, this general powerlessness was compounded by every circumstance of her life. She was not merely a woman in a world that gave women little power. She was a poor relation, dependent entirely on the charity of richer kin, without the independent wealth or standing that might have given even a woman of that age some small measure of leverage. She was motherless, without the one figure who might most naturally have advocated for her interests. She was young and undereducated, with none of the knowledge or worldliness that might have helped her navigate her situation. And she was caught between the two most powerful forces in the kingdom, the desire of the king and the ambition of her family, both of them bearing down upon her, both of them accustomed to absolute obedience. For such a girl to have resisted being made queen, to have refused the king and defied her family, would have required a strength and an independence that her whole life had conspired to deny her. She had been reared to dependence and obedience, given no resources of her own, and then confronted with overwhelming power, and in such a situation the notion that she freely chose her fate is almost meaningless. She was carried to it, as women in her world were so often carried to their fates by the will of the men who held sway over her. And the same powerlessness that carried her to the throne left her utterly exposed when she fell, for a woman in that world had few defences and fewer advocates when the mighty turned against her. When the investigation came, Catherine had no independent counsel, no advocate, no one whose duty or interest it was to defend her. Her family, far from protecting her, scrambled to abandon her and save themselves. Her husband, the king, had become her destroyer. She faced the full machinery of the state alone, a young woman with no strength and no protector, and she was condemned without even the trial that might have given her some chance to speak in her own defence. The same structures that had denied her any say in her rise denied her any say in her fall, leaving her as helpless before her destruction as she had been before her elevation. She was, from beginning to end, an object acted upon rather than an agent acting, raised up by the will of others, and cast down by the will of others, with her own will counting for almost nothing at any point in the whole tragic arc of her short life. No, there is a broader sorrow here, beyond Catherine's individual tragedy, for she was only one of countless women whose lives were shaped and often destroyed by the powerlessness that was the common condition of her sex in that age. The 6 wives of Henry VIII themselves are a kind of catalogue of the ways a woman might be used and discarded by the men who held power over her, set aside, beheaded, worn out in childbed, rejected, destroyed, their lives bent entirely to the needs and desires and whims of a single powerful man. And below the level of queens, the same patterns played out in countless ordinary lives, women married off for advantage, subordinated to husbands and fathers, their fates decided by others, their own wishes counting for nothing. Catherine's tale is that of one particular girl with its own particular sorrows, but it is also a window onto the broader condition of women in her world, the powerlessness, the dependence, the subjection to the will of men, and seeing it so, we may feel not only compassion for Catherine herself, but a wider sorrow for all the women of that age, whose lives were shaped by forces they could not control, and decisions they had no part in making. She was not wicked. She was not even, in any meaningful sense, the author of her own destruction. She was a girl who was failed, comprehensively and fatally, by each adult charged with her care. Her mother died too soon to guard her. Her father was too feckless and too poor to care for her. The Duchess and her household, who took her in, neglected her so badly that she was left prey to the men who exploited her. Her family, who should have been her shield, used her instead as a tool, pushing her toward a throne that had already killed one of their daughters. And the king who married her, and the court that surrounded her, and the law that condemned her, all of them treated her not as a person to be protected, but as an object to be used and then discarded. At every stage of her short life, the people with power over her chose their own interests over her welfare, and when their schemes collapsed, It was the powerless figure at the centre of them who paid the price with her life. She is not a cautionary tale about female folly. She is a tragedy about the failure of the mighty to protect the vulnerable, about what happens to a girl whom no one ever truly cared for, and she deserves not our scorn, but our deep and lasting compassion. Among the 6 wives she holds a particular and a piteous position. She was the youngest by far, the least prepared, the most thoroughly failed by those around her. Where Catherine of Aragon had her learning and her royal pride, where Anne Boleyn had her wit and her ambition, where Jane Seymour had her careful discretion, where Anne of Cleves had her shrewd good sense, Catherine Howard had none of these defences, none of the education, or the cunning, or the wisdom that might have helped her navigate the deadly world she was thrown into. She had only her youth and her prettiness and her sweet pleasure-loving nature, and these were not defences at all, but the very things that doomed her, the bait that drew the king, and the qualities that her family exploited. She was the most innocent of the 6, in the true sense of that word, the least responsible for her own fate, the most purely a victim of forces beyond her control and understanding. And she was the second of the 2 who died upon the scaffold, following her cousin Anne to the same dreadful end. But the 2 Howard girls, raised up by the same family's ambition, and cut down by the same king's wrath, their blood spilled upon the same ground, a matched pair of tragedies bracketing the strange middle years of Henry's reign. Let us step back now and consider Catherine through the eyes of our own age, for the passage of 5 centuries has given us a vantage from which we can see her tragedy more clearly and more justly than her own time could, and what we see is a story not of female wickedness, but of the failure to protect a vulnerable girl. The cruel old verdict on Catherine, the verdict of the foolish wanton queen who deserved her fate, belongs to an age that saw a young woman's sexuality as her own sin and her own responsibility, that blamed the girl for what was done to her, that held a child accountable for the failures of the adults around her. We see it differently now, or we should, for we have learned, slowly and at bitter cost, to recognise the patterns of exploitation and neglect that Catherine's story so clearly displays, and to place the responsibility where it truly belongs, not with the vulnerable child, but with the adults who failed and exploited her. Consider what we would say, in our own time, about a girl in Catherine's situation. Motherless, sent away to be brought up in a household where she was barely supervised. Targeted and exploited by older men in positions of relative authority, or when she was only 13 or 14, failed by each adult responsible for her welfare, left prey to those who would take advantage of her. We would not, in our own age, call such a person wicked or wanton. We would call her a victim. We would direct our anger at the adults who failed her, at the negligent household, at the predatory men, at the absent guardians. We would see her early experiences not as her sins, but as wrongs done to her, the entirely predictable consequence of leaving the vulnerable unprotected, and we would extend to her our compassion and our protection, not our blame. That is how we would see her, and seeing her so, we cannot then turn around and blame the woman she became for the recklessness that grew so directly out of that ruined and exploited youth. For the recklessness of her marriage, the fatal intimacy with Culpeper, flowed directly from all that had been done to her and not done for her. She had been brought up without guidance, without the steady formation that teaches a young person caution and judgment. She had grown up in a household where exactly such unguarded attachments were winked at, learning heedless habits that no one corrected. She had been thrust, undereducated and unprepared, into the most dangerous position in the kingdom, married to a man she could not have desired, lonely and frightened, and reaching for warmth. And when she reached for it, recklessly, foolishly, as a poorly reared and unguided young person so easily might, She was destroyed for it, killed for the predictable consequence of a lifetime of failure by the adults responsible for her. To blame Catherine for that recklessness is to blame the product for the flaws of its making, to hold the child accountable for the failures of those who raised her, to complete the injustice of her life with an injustice of memory. The kindest and the truest thing we can do for Catherine, across the gulf of 500 years, is simply to see her clearly, to understand her life as it really was. She was not a wicked woman. She was a failed and exploited and unguided child, who became a frightened and reckless and lonely young woman, who was used and then destroyed by the mighty people around her, and who died, terrified and alone, but before she was 20, for crimes that were mostly the wrongs done to her, and follies that were mostly the products of her abandonment. She deserved protection, and got none. She deserved guidance, and got none. She deserved compassion, and got none in her own short life. It is too late to save her, of course. It was too late the moment she was born into that family and that situation. But it is not too late, even now, to understand her, and understanding, as we shall see, is its own gentle form of mercy. There is a question worth sitting with, of why Catherine's tale still moves us, after 500 years, when so many tragedies of that distant age have faded into mere history. Part of the answer, I think, is that her tale touches something timeless, something that reaches across the centuries to speak directly to our own deepest concerns. For at its heart, Catherine's tragedy is about the failure to protect the vulnerable, and that is a failure we recognize and grieve over still. Every age has its vulnerable children, its young people left unguarded, its victims of the carelessness and the appetites and the ambitions of the powerful. The particular forms change. The noble households and the royal marriages and the scaffolds belong to a vanished world, but the essential pattern is one we know all too well. The pattern of a child failed by the adults who should have protected her, exploited by those who should have cared for her, used and then discarded by those who held power over her. Catherine's story is a Tudor tale, bound up in the particular cruelties of her own age, but it is also a human one, and the human heart of it speaks to us as clearly now as it would have to anyone who truly looked at it then. There is, too, a particular poignancy in the youth of her, in the sheer waste of a life cut off before it had really begun, that touches us deeply. Catherine was perhaps 18 or 19 when she died, a girl really, with most of her life still before her, and all of it was taken from her, snuffed out on a cold morning to satisfy an old king's wounded pride. We feel the waste of it, the cruelty of a young life destroyed before it had any chance to grow and change and perhaps to redeem its early follies. For Catherine might have grown wiser, had she lived. The recklessness of her youth might have given way to the judgment of maturity. The girl who stumbled so badly might have become a woman who learned from her stumbling. But she was given no chance to grow, no chance to learn, no chance to become anything more than the frightened girl who knelt at the block before she was 20. The waste of that, the cruelty of cutting off a life before it had any chance to fulfill itself, is part of what makes her fate so enduringly sad. And there is the simple injustice of it, the way she was made to bear the whole weight of consequences for failures that were mostly not her own, that offends our sense of fairness and stirs our compassion. We have traced, through her whole story, the long chain of adults who failed her, the dead mother, the feckless father, the negligent household, the predatory men, the ambitious family, the desirous king, the merciless court, and we have seen how at every stage the people with power over her chose their own interests over her welfare, until at the end the powerless girl was left to pay, with her life, for the accumulated failures of them all. There is a deep injustice in that, in the spectacle of the vulnerable bearing the cost of the failures of the powerful. And it is an injustice we recognise and resent, for it is not confined to Catherine's age, but is one of the oldest and most persistent of human wrongs. Catherine moves us, in part, because it is an extreme and vivid instance of an injustice we know in our own world, the injustice of the weak suffering for the failures of the strong. But perhaps in the end, the deepest reason her story moves us is simply that she was so young, so helpless, and so alone, and that no one was kind to her when kindness might have saved her. There is something in the human heart that responds to the suffering of the helpless and the defenceless, that wishes to protect them, that grieves when they are harmed, and Catherine, the unguarded child, the failed and exploited girl, the frightened young woman who died alone, calls forth that response in us across all the distance of the centuries. We cannot save her, of course. Her tragedy was complete and final 500 years ago, and nothing we feel now can change a moment of it. But we can mourn her, and we can understand her, and we can grant her, in our remembering, the compassion that her own hard world denied her, and there is perhaps some small value in that, some quiet act of justice in the simple refusal to let the cruel old verdict stand, in the choice to see her clearly and to remember her kindly. She was a child who was failed by everyone, and who deserved so much better, and the least we can do, looking back, is to give her at last the understanding and the tenderness that she should have been given in life, and was not. There is a quiet place within the walls of the Tower of London where Catherine's story comes to its final rest, and it is worth ending our journey there, in the small church where she lies, for it gathers up the whole meaning of her tragedy into a single still and sorrowful image. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula is a modest place, built within the fortress to serve those who lived and worked there, and beneath its floor lie the bodies of many of those who were executed within the tower walls across the centuries, the mighty and the fallen, the nobles and ministers and queens who offended the crown and paid for it with their lives. It is in its quiet way one of the most haunted spots in England, this small chapel where so much spilled blood came finally to rest, the bones of the executed gathered beneath the stone floor, the witnesses of so many endings, and among those who lie there, close together beneath the floor of that little church, are the two Howard queens, the two cousins, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, united at last in death, as they had been united in blood and in fate. There is a piercing sadness in the thought of the two cousins lying there together, the maids raised up by the same family's ambition, and cut down by the same king's wrath, their bones mingled in the same hallowed ground. Anne had been laid there first, in 1536, after her execution, her body bundled hastily into a chest, and buried beneath the chapel floor with little ceremony. And then, 6 years later, Catherine was brought to the same church, after her own execution, on the same patch of ground outside, and laid to rest near her cousin, the second Howard Queen to come to this final resting spot. They had been so different in life, the sophisticated, ambitious, formidable Anne, and the young, unguided, helpless Catherine, divided by a generation, and by temperament, and by the very different characters of their tragedies. But in death they were brought together, the two cousins, the two queens, the two victims of the same family and the same king, lying side by side beneath the floor of the little chapel, their long quarrel with the world finally over, their suffering finally at an end. For centuries they lay there half forgotten, the church and its tragic dead largely neglected, until in a later age the building was restored, and the remains of those buried beneath it were examined and identified and reburied with more care and dignity than they had received at their deaths. And so today the two Howard Queens lie marked and remembered in the church floor, their names recorded, their resting place known, two of the most famous and most tragic women in all of English history, gathered together in the hush of the little church within the fortress walls. Visitors come now to that church and stand on the stone floor beneath which the executed lie, and remember the men and women who died so terribly in that place, and among them the two young Howard queens, the cousins who shared a family and a king and a scaffold and a grave. It is a still place, and a sad one, and there is a measure of peace in it now, the peace that comes at last to those whose suffering is long over, the peace that Catherine, in her short and troubled life, so rarely knew. She had so little in her short life, so scant in care, so bare of protection, so wanting in the gentleness that any child deserves. And she came, at the end of it all, to that quiet chapel, to lie beside the cousin whose fate she had been doomed to repeat. Too, the maids at rest, at last beneath the stone, their troubles over, their suffering ended, gathered into the long silence that comes to us all. It is a sorrowful spot, but there is a measure of comfort in it too, in the stillness and the hush and the long rest, and in the thought that whatever was denied to Catherine in life, she has at least, at the last, the peace of the grave. And so the candles are burning low, and Catherine's short sad tale is told, all the way from the crowded, neglectful chambers of her girlhood to the cold scaffold within the tower, and there is nothing left to do tonight but let it settle, and let go of the hard old judgment, and hold her instead with the gentleness she was so rarely given. Let the cruel legend fall away, the foolish wanton queen of the storybooks, and remember instead the truth of her, the motherless child, the neglected girl, the young creature failed by all who should have loved her. There is a deep sadness in her story, but there can be a measure of peace in it too, in the simple act of seeing her at last as she truly was, and granting her, 5 centuries too late, the compassion that no one granted her in life. For if we cannot save her, we can at least understand her, and understanding is its own quiet kind of mercy. Let her be young again, as you drift towards sleep. Before any of the rest of it came, a girl dancing in a gorgeous gown, delighting in the music and the colour and the gaiety, all unaware of what lay ahead, and let that be the picture you carry down into the dark, not the scaffold but the dance, not the ending, but the bright, brief moment of a young girl's joy. If you have found something restful here tonight, in this slow and gentle walk through a life lived so long ago, then you are very welcome to subscribe before you go, so that the next of these long evenings finds its way to you when you need one. Wherever you are in the world tonight, and whatever the hour, I hope the dark is kind to you, and the bed is warm, and the morning, when it comes, is gentle. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.